There are moments when history feels distant, sealed behind stone and dust, but sometimes, if you listen carefully, it breathes again, not loudly, not urgently, just enough to remind you that time never truly forgets. Tonight is not about endings. It is about what quietly remains when endings pass. The fragments that slip through catastrophe unnoticed, the memories that choose to survive inside stone, myth, and silence. Let the present loosen its grip. Imagine the world between breaths, after something vast has ended and before something new has fully begun. This is where our story waits. Resets do not arrive like clean slates. They come as overwhelming tides, as firestorms of forgetting, as slow collapses stretched across generations. When the dust settles, what remains is never random. Something endures, deliberately or accidentally, carrying forward the shape of what comes next. Civilizations are not reborn from nothing. They rise from what catastrophe fails to erase. If you feel drawn to these quiet continuities, you may choose to subscribe, not as a commitment, but as a way of returning. A soft mark left in time, reminding you that these stories will still be here when you are ready to listen again. Long before writing, before kings, before cities stacked upon cities, there were people who understood that survival was not only physical. Knowledge itself had to be preserved, disguised, embedded into ritual, landscape, and story. After the last great reset, humanity did not begin again as children. It began as inheritors, though most did not realize what they had inherited. Across the ancient world, certain places seemed to reappear after disaster, as if pulled back into relevance by memory itself. Sacred hills rise again. Stone circles are rebuilt. The same constellations are watched. It is as though catastrophe clears the surface, but the deeper patterns remain untouched. These are not coincidences. They are echoes of continuity. One of these echoes stands in silence on a limestone ridge in southeastern Anatolia. Older than cities, older than agriculture according to conventional timelines, a place that does not fit comfortably into linear history. Göbekli Tepe does not look like a beginning, it looks like a return. Massive stone pillars were raised there by hands that should not have known how according to modern assumptions. They were carved with animals that no longer lived in the region, symbols whose meanings feel deliberate but elusive. There is no evidence of permanent settlement, no homes, no hearths, only effort, only intention, only memory made stone. Göbekli Tepe feels less like a birthplace of civilization and more like a bridge between worlds, between what was lost and what would be rebuilt. Its builders did not leave explanations. They left alignment, orientation, patterns that mirror the sky, knowledge that suggests continuity from a time before the last collapse. After resets, survival favors those who remember differently, not through books or monuments that invite destruction, but through stories that change shape without losing meaning, through myths that encode astronomy, through rituals that teach agriculture without instruction manuals, through sacred sites placed where memory itself seems to gather. And even now, in a world that believes itself distant from such collapses, the sky occasionally offers quiet reminders, not warnings, not prophecies, just rare arrivals that pass through our awareness briefly, like Three-Eye Atlas, reminding us that continuity has never been guaranteed. What survives becomes the blueprint, and what is forgotten shapes us just as powerfully as what is remembered. Somewhere between the stones of Göbekli Tepe and the questions stirred by the modern sky, a quiet truth waits. Civilization did not wake up suddenly. It remembered. It remembered slowly, in fragments, in instincts that felt older than language itself. The knowledge that survived the reset did not announce itself as ancient wisdom. It blended into daily life, quietly guiding hands and seasons, shaping choices without revealing its origin. Humanity moved forward carrying memories it no longer recognized as memories. After catastrophe, the world would have looked unfamiliar. Coastlines altered, rivers changed their courses, animals vanished or migrated, forests reclaimed open land. Yet beneath these changes, patterns endured. The sky still moved in cycles. The sun returned to the same points on the horizon. Certain stars still rose when it was time to plant, and others warned when cold or drought approached. Those who noticed survived more easily than those who did not. This is where knowledge becomes something other than information. It becomes inheritance. Astronomy did not survive as charts or calculations. It survived as story, as gods who died and returned, as serpents in the sky, as celestial hunters and cosmic floods. Each myth carried practical truth, wrapped in narrative, safe from forgetting. Agriculture, too, did not simply emerge from experimentation alone. It arrived with timing. Seeds planted too early fail. Too late, they starve. Knowing when to act mattered as much as knowing how. After a reset, calendars would have been lost, but seasonal memory remained, preserved in ritual festivals, in songs tied to solstices, in monuments aligned with equinoxes. Stone became a substitute for writing. The land itself became a record. Across continents, similar patterns appear. Survivors gravitated back to certain latitudes, certain river systems, certain elevated plateaus. These were not arbitrary choices. They were informed by memory older than the people themselves. Places that had endured before were trusted to endure again. Even when the reason was forgotten, the instinct remained. This may explain why some locations feel repeatedly chosen by history. Cities rise, fall, and rise again in the same places. Temples are rebuilt on older foundations. Sacred mountains remain sacred across entirely different cultures. It is as if memory itself is embedded in geography, guiding human return after every collapse. What survives a reset is not evenly distributed. It concentrates. Small groups carry disproportionate inheritance. A few lineages, a few storytellers, a few observers of the sky. Over generations, this knowledge spreads outward, diluted but persistent, shaping the next civilization's worldview. And yet, each time, something is lost. The deeper context fades. The reason behind the ritual becomes symbolic rather than understood. Precision becomes tradition. Observation becomes belief. Still, even in its degraded form, inherited knowledge remains powerful enough to restart civilization. This is not progress in a straight line. It is continuity through erosion. Each reset smooths the edges, removes details, but the core persists. Humanity does not begin again from zero. It resumes from a hidden checkpoint. Göbekli Tepe stands as evidence of this moment. Not a spark of invention, but a resurfacing of something older. A reminder that after the world breaks, memory does not vanish. It waits, patiently, for hands ready to remember again. It waits in places where time feels thinner, where stone holds silence longer than words ever could. After resets, humanity does not scatter randomly across the world. It gathers around what still feels familiar, even when familiarity cannot be explained. Certain landscapes call people back as if they have been used before, as if they remember being useful. This is why some sites feel older than the civilizations that claim them. They were not chosen once. They were chosen repeatedly. Each return layered new meaning over ancient foundations until origin became impossible to trace. The land itself became a witness, absorbing cycles of use, abandonment, and return. In the aftermath of catastrophe, rebuilding is not an act of ambition. It is an act of necessity guided by memory. Survivors seek elevated ground, reliable water, predictable seasons. But beyond practicality, they seek resonance, places that feel right, places where stories already linger even if no one remembers why. Göbekli Tepe exists within this pattern, but it is not alone. Across the world, similar anomalies appear, structures that seem to arrive too early in the historical timeline. engineering knowledge that appears fully formed, symbol systems that emerge already complex. These are not beginnings. They are continuations interrupted by disaster. After a reset, there is little time for experimentation. Survival demands certainty. This may explain why early post-catastrophe societies appear conservative, ritualistic, even rigid. Innovation is risky when memory suggests that deviation once led to collapse. Tradition becomes a safety mechanism. Repetition becomes protection. Cultural memory, then, is not passive. It is selective. It carries forward what worked before and quietly discards what failed. Myths that survive do so because they encode something useful. Rituals endure because they stabilize communities. Sacred laws persist because they regulate behavior during fragile rebuilding phases. Over time, these systems grow abstract. What was once practical knowledge becomes moral code. What was once environmental awareness becomes divine command. The story remains, but the original lesson recedes into the background. Still, the structure holds. This is how civilizations rebuild faster than they should. They are not inventing from scratch. They are reactivating dormant frameworks. Even language carries traces of this inheritance, repeating symbolic patterns across cultures that never met, as if drawing from a shared older source. The appearance of similar flood myths, sky gods, world mountains, and golden ages is not coincidence. These narratives may be compressed memories of previous cycles, reduced to archetype but not erased. They offer continuity where history appears broken. Resets fracture timelines, but they do not sever them. The thread thins, but it remains unbroken. And each time humanity believes it is standing at the beginning, it is actually standing on top of layers of forgotten endings. Somewhere beneath those layers, the question remains. If knowledge can survive catastrophe in disguised forms, what else might endure? And what might we be carrying forward now without recognizing its origin? Waiting for the next moment when memory becomes necessary again. Waiting for necessity is how memory survives its longest sleep. Knowledge rarely announces itself when it is most fragile. It hides inside repetition, inside habits that feel ordinary, inside stories told to children who do not yet know they are inheriting instructions. After the reset, survival favors those who listen more than those who invent. As generations pass, the survivors of catastrophe become ancestors, then myths, then symbols. Their direct experience fades, but the structures they built remain, not only in stone, but in social order, seasonal rhythm, and sacred obligation. What once ensured survival becomes identity. People no longer remember why they do something. They only remember that it must be done. This process leaves behind a strange archaeological signature, sudden leaps in complexity, cultures that appear already organized, already cosmological, already aligned with the heavens. From the outside, it looks miraculous. From within the cycle, it is simply memory returning to the surface. Göbekli Tepe may represent such a return point, not the invention of ritual, but its reactivation, not the birth of symbolism, but its resurfacing after dormancy. The builders did not experiment with small stones before raising pillars that weighed dozens of tons. They acted with confidence, as if they were following instructions rather than improvising. Confidence is a clue. It suggests precedent. It suggests that the knowledge of how to organize labor, how to carve stone, how to align structures with the sky was not discovered there for the first time. It was recalled. After a reset, societies do not have the luxury of long trial and error. The margin for failure is too thin. Communities gravitate toward what feels proven. This may explain why early monuments focus less on comfort and more on meaning. Shelter can be improvised. Orientation cannot. Knowing where you are in time matters as much as knowing where you are in space. The sky becomes the most reliable archive. Stars do not flood. They do not burn. They do not forget. Even after the land reshapes itself, the heavens remain consistent enough to rebuild calendars, seasons, and ritual cycles. This is why astronomy appears so early and so persistently in post-reset cultures. It is the fastest way to regain orientation. Myths of gods descending, teaching, then departing may reflect this moment of reorientation, not literal beings, but remembered systems of knowledge personified to ensure survival. When information is sacred, it is protected. When it is divine, it is obeyed. Over time, however, reverence replaces understanding. The system continues to function, but its operators forget how it was built. The reset does not only erase structures, it erases context. Humanity keeps the tools, but forgets the manual. This is the quiet danger of survival through memory alone. What is preserved may endure long enough to rebuild civilization, but not long enough to prevent repetition. When the deeper causes of collapse are forgotten, the cycle becomes inevitable. The stones of ancient sites do not warn. They only witness. They mark where humanity stood before and where it returned after forgetting. And as each generation builds atop the last, believing itself new, the deeper question remains buried beneath ritual and ruin. If memory can guide us back after catastrophe, can it also guide us away from repeating it? Or does inheritance, without understanding, ensure that resets are not accidents, but expectations waiting patiently in time? Expectations form quietly, long before they are recognized. They settle into worldview, into assumptions about how the world behaves and how it ends. When resets become part of inherited memory, even unconsciously, humanity adapts not to prevent them, but to endure them. Survival replaces foresight. Continuity replaces transformation. This may be why so many ancient traditions speak less about avoiding catastrophe and more about passing through it. Flood myths do not focus on stopping the waters. They focus on arcs, seeds, chosen survivors, and preservation. Fire myths do not prevent destruction. They promise renewal afterward. The lesson is not escape, it is endurance. After the last reset, people may have understood something we no longer consciously do. That collapse was not an anomaly, it was a phase. And phases require preparation, not denial. Knowledge worth saving had to be compressed, disguised, and made resilient enough to survive chaos. This compression changes knowledge itself. Complex systems become symbols. Technical understanding becomes moral story. Instructions become commandments. What remains is durable, but incomplete. Enough to rebuild, not enough to fully understand what came before. Over time, this creates a paradox. Humanity becomes advanced again, but along slightly altered paths. Each cycle drifts, tools improve, but wisdom fragments. The core truths survive, but the details erode. Civilization returns, but never quite the same way twice. This drift may explain why ancient knowledge sometimes feels familiar yet unreachable, why certain achievements appear just beyond our ability to replicate without modern technology, why some ancient sites feel engineered with intent we can sense but not fully decode. We recognize the outcome, but not the process. Memory, when stripped of context, becomes destiny. It shapes behavior without offering choice. People follow patterns because they feel ancient, trustworthy, inevitable. The cycle repeats not because humanity fails to learn, but because it learns only how to continue, not how to change direction. The appearance of rare celestial objects in the modern sky serves as a quiet reminder of this fragility, not as a threat, but as a mirror, a reflection of how easily continuity can be interrupted, how quickly accumulated knowledge can be reduced to fragments again. This is where the idea of 3i or Atlas fits naturally, without force, not as a cause of past resets, but as a symbol of vulnerability, a reminder that history is shaped not only by what humanity does, but by what it endures. The sky has always played a role in resetting the human story, directly or indirectly. If resets shaped humanity before, then awareness of them now carries responsibility, not fear, but memory with context. The difference between inheritance and understanding may determine whether continuity remains passive or becomes intentional. Ancient survivors carried knowledge forward without knowing who would receive it. They trusted time to deliver it when needed. We are now on the receiving end of countless forgotten preparations. The question is not whether something survived. It is whether we recognize it in time to do something different with it. As the cycle continues to turn, the silence between catastrophes grows louder, and in that silence, the past does not ask for worship. It asks for attention. Attention is the rarest inheritance. Most knowledge survives without being seen, waiting in plain sight, embedded in language, ritual, and habit. The farther humanity moves from its last reset, the less urgent memory feels. Comfort dulls curiosity. Stability creates the illusion of permanence. The lessons encoded by survivors begin to feel symbolic rather than practical. This is when civilizations become most vulnerable, not at their weakest, but at their most confident. When continuity seems guaranteed, when progress feels linear, when catastrophe is reclassified as myth instead of possibility. The same stories that once served as warnings become entertainment, their urgency softened by distance. Ancient builders understood this fragility. They placed memory where it would be hardest to ignore, in stone that demanded effort, in alignments that required observation, in myths tied to the sky itself. These were not expressions of belief alone. They were systems designed to outlast forgetting. But even stone erodes. Alignments drift. Languages shift. Each generation inherits a version slightly less precise than the one before. The message remains, but its clarity fades. What was once a map becomes a symbol. What was once a warning becomes tradition. Civilizations that survive a reset do not carry everything forward. They make choices, often unconsciously. Some knowledge is prioritized, some is sacrificed. Survival knowledge comes first. Philosophical understanding comes later, if at all. Over time, rebuilding accelerates, but depth lags behind. This imbalance creates civilizations that appear advanced but remain fragile, technologically capable, yet historically shallow, powerful, yet unaware of the cycles beneath their feet. The reset does not need to announce itself. It only needs to arrive. Ancient myths often speak of arrogance before collapse, not moral arrogance, but temporal arrogance. The belief that the present moment represents completion rather than continuation, that the world as it is now is the world as it will remain. This belief is the most consistent precursor to forgetting. The survivors of previous cycles likely did not see themselves as chosen or enlightened. They were simply attentive. They noticed patterns. They remembered what others overlooked. Their advantage was not strength, but awareness of impermanence. As time passed, even that awareness became diluted. The descendants of survivors inherited structure without urgency, memory without fear, knowledge without context. The cycle stabilized, then accelerated, then forgot why stability mattered. This is how resets remain possible, not through sudden ignorance, but through gradual disconnection. Humanity does not lose its past all at once. It sets it aside, piece by piece, until it no longer recognizes the warning signs when they return. Somewhere between ancient stone circles and modern skies, the same question repeats itself. Not whether civilization will endure, but whether it will remember why it was rebuilt the last time. The answer has never been written plainly. It has only ever been implied, waiting for attention strong enough to notice it again. Noticing has always been the dividing line between those who adapt and those who assume, between those who remember and those who repeat. After every reset, a small number of people seem to sense that the world has not simply changed, but resumed. They live with a quiet awareness that what surrounds them is not permanent, only paused. This awareness shapes how knowledge is treated. It becomes something to protect, not to display, something to pass sideways rather than upward. The most resilient information is not stored in single structures or centralized systems. It is distributed across culture, woven into everyday life, so that even if parts are lost, the whole can be reconstructed. This may explain why ancient knowledge often appears fragmented: astronomy without equations, engineering without blueprints, medicine without written theory. These fragments were never meant to survive alone. They were designed to be reassembled by a future mind capable of recognizing the pattern. In this way, civilization after a reset resembles memory after trauma. Not everything returns at once. Some details are suppressed, others surface unexpectedly. The process is uneven, emotional, and slow. But beneath it all, continuity persists. The builders of early post-reset sites likely understood this intuitively. They did not attempt to recreate the world exactly as it had been. They adapted knowledge to new conditions, new landscapes, new social realities. What mattered was not precision, but orientation, knowing when to plant, knowing where to gather, knowing which stories mattered most. This adaptive memory creates the illusion of innovation. From the outside, it looks like sudden genius. From the inside, it feels like recognition, a remembering rather than a discovery. Civilization advances, but with an undercurrent of familiarity that cannot be explained. Over generations, this familiarity fades. What once felt remembered begins to feel invented. Credit shifts from inheritance to originality. The past becomes something to overcome, rather than something to listen to. This is another quiet threshold, rarely noticed when crossed. Once the connection weakens, knowledge becomes easier to lose. Systems grow complex without being resilient. Progress accelerates faster than understanding. The memory of resets becomes abstract, then optional, then dismissible. At that point, the cycle is already preparing to turn again. The ancient world did not warn in plain language, because plain language does not survive catastrophe. It warned through pattern, through repetition, through the strange feeling that certain stories keep returning, no matter how many times they are forgotten. Even now, that pattern remains intact. The sky still moves in cycles. The land still reshapes itself. Humanity still builds, forgets, rebuilds. The only variable has ever been awareness, and awareness, once lost, is the hardest thing to recover. Recovering it requires humility, a quality rarely celebrated during times of growth. Awareness asks us to see ourselves not as the culmination of history, but as one moment within it. This perspective is uncomfortable. It destabilizes narratives of progress and permanence. Yet, it is the only position from which cycles can be recognized rather than merely endured. Ancient civilizations seem to understand this instinctively. Their monuments often dwarf the individual, emphasizing scale over comfort, duration over immediacy. Standing before such structures, one feels small, but also connected. This was not accidental. It was a lesson embedded in architecture, a reminder that human presence is brief, but participation in time is continuous. After resets, this humility is natural. Survival strips away illusion. The world feels larger, more powerful, less controllable. People listen more closely to land and sky. They measure time carefully. They rebuild slowly. But as stability returns, humility fades. Mastery replaces observation. Control replaces cooperation. The old balance dissolves. This transition is subtle. It does not feel like forgetting. It feels like confidence. Each improvement reinforces the belief that the cycle has been broken, that this time is different. Yet history suggests that this belief itself may be the final symptom before repetition. What makes Göbekli Tepe and similar sites so unsettling is not their age, but their restraint. They do not celebrate conquest or expansion. They do not glorify rulers or victories. They focus on alignment, on gathering, on shared orientation toward something larger than the human story. This suggests a culture more concerned with continuity than dominance. Such priorities make sense in a post-reset world. When survival has been uncertain, cooperation matters more than hierarchy. Shared knowledge matters more than ownership. Memory becomes communal, not centralized. These values stabilize rebuilding, but they are fragile. Over time, they give way to specialization, stratification, and control. As civilizations grow, the need for shared memory weakens. Systems replace stories. Records replace rituals. Efficiency replaces meaning. Knowledge becomes something external, stored and referenced, rather than lived and remembered. This shift brings power, but it also introduces a single point of failure. When centralized systems collapse, they take memory with them. This is how resets erase so much so quickly, not through destruction alone, but through dependency. The more knowledge is removed from daily life, the easier it is to lose entirely. The survivors of previous cycles likely understood this risk, even if only intuitively. They chose redundancy over precision, myth over manual, stone over paper. Their legacy is not efficiency, but endurance. As we move further from our own last reset, the question becomes unavoidable. Are we preserving knowledge in ways that can survive interruption, or only in forms that assume continuity? The answer may already be encoded in what we choose to remember and what we allow ourselves to forget. And somewhere beneath that choice, the cycle waits, patient as ever, unchanged by belief, unaffected by progress, ready to continue whether we notice it or not. Unchanged cycles do not announce their return. They do not need permission, belief, or acknowledgement. They unfold according to conditions, not convictions. What humanity experiences as history, these cycles experience as rhythm. Rise follows recovery. Expansion follows memory. Collapse follows forgetting. The pattern does not judge. It repeats. In ancient thought, time was rarely imagined as a straight line. It curved, it circled, it returned. Seasons taught this first. Day and night reinforced it. Birth and death made it unavoidable. Civilizations that survived resets internalized this worldview. They did not expect permanence. They prepared for recurrence. This cyclical understanding shaped how knowledge was framed. Information meant to survive catastrophe could not depend on uninterrupted transmission. It had to reappear naturally, rediscovered by each generation as if for the first time. This made it resilient. Even if forgotten, it could be found again. Cosmology became the ideal vessel for this purpose. The sky is shared by all cultures, all eras. Its patterns repeat reliably enough to be recognized, but slowly enough to demand attention. By embedding knowledge into celestial stories, ancient survivors ensured that future civilizations would eventually look up and remember. The gods of ancient pantheons were not merely characters. They were placeholders for forces, cycles, and thresholds. Creation myths mirrored rebuilding phases. Destruction myths echoed collapse. Rebirth myths encoded recovery. Each story functioned as a compressed map of the cycle itself. This is why similar mythic structures appear independently across the world, not because cultures borrowed from one another, but because they inherited the same problem. How do you warn the future without knowing who the future will be? How do you preserve context when context is the first casualty of disaster? The solution was symbolism layered deeply enough to survive reinterpretation. Even when the original meaning was lost, the structure remained intact. The story could be retold, reshaped, and repurposed, yet still guide behavior in subtle ways. This is also why ancient cosmologies often blur the line between past and future. Ages repeat. Worlds end and begin again. Heroes return in new forms. These are not fantasies. They are reflections of lived experience across cycles too long for individual memory, but not too long for cultural instinct. As civilizations grew more confident, this cyclical awareness softened. Linear progress offered comfort. It suggested escape from repetition. But beneath that belief, the older understanding never fully disappeared. It lingered in ritual calendars, in apocalyptic expectations, in the quiet suspicion that something would eventually reset the balance. Göbekli Tepe, standing at the edge of known history, feels like a marker placed by those who still remembered the cycle clearly. Not a warning sign, but a reference point. A way to say, this has happened before, and it will happen again. The question is not whether humanity can break the cycle. The deeper question is whether recognizing it changes anything at all. Whether recognition changes anything has always been uncertain. Awareness alone does not prevent repetition. It only creates the possibility of choice. In past cycles, that possibility may have been too fragile, too easily overwhelmed by survival needs and rebuilding urgency. Memory returned just long enough to restart the world, not long enough to reshape its trajectory. After resets, civilizations inherit urgency without context. They know something must be preserved, but not everything. They know time is dangerous, but not why. This creates cultures obsessed with order, with maintaining balance, with appeasing forces they only partially understand. Stability becomes sacred, even when it quietly reproduces the conditions for future collapse. Ancient societies encoded this tension into their cosmologies. Golden ages give way to declining eras. Harmony degrades into conflict. Balance is lost, then restored through destruction. These narratives do not celebrate collapse. They accept it as correction, a reset not as punishment, but as recalibration. This worldview shapes how responsibility is perceived. If collapse is inevitable, then preparation becomes more important than prevention. Survivors are not heroes because they saved the world, but because they carried something through its ending. The measure of success shifts from permanence to transmission. Seen this way, monuments like Göbekli Tepe are less about worship and more about stewardship. They do not attempt to dominate nature or time. They align with it. They acknowledge forces beyond human control and choose cooperation over resistance. This may be the most pragmatic response to an unpredictable world. Over time, however, this humility transforms. As generations pass without catastrophe, alignment becomes tradition, then symbolism, then mystery. The original pragmatic relationship with cycles becomes abstract. What once prepared people for change begins to anchor them to repetition instead. Civilizations grow more complex but also more brittle. Systems interlock tightly, leaving little room for disruption. Efficiency increases, redundancy decreases, knowledge concentrates, memory externalizes. When interruption finally comes, it spreads faster and deeper than before. This fragility is not new. It has appeared in every advanced civilization that believed itself to be exceptional. The belief is understandable. Progress feels real. Achievements accumulate. The past seems distant and primitive. But resets do not measure intelligence or morality. They measure resilience. Ancient survivors may have sensed this difference. Their goal was not to build the greatest civilization, but the one most likely to endure through forgetting. That endurance required compromise, slower growth, shared knowledge, acceptance of limits. These are not qualities rewarded by expansion-driven societies. As humanity rebuilds again and again, it seems drawn toward the same tension, between ambition and continuity, between mastery and memory. Each cycle tests whether awareness can outpace repetition. The fact that this question still feels unresolved suggests that recognition alone has never been enough. Something more is required, something that ancient survivors may have attempted to leave behind, hidden not in answers, but in the question itself, waiting for a future capable of hearing it differently. Hearing it differently requires distance from certainty. The ancient world did not seek final answers. It accepted provisional ones, knowing they would be revised by catastrophe. This flexibility was not intellectual weakness. It was adaptive strength. A civilization that believes its explanations are temporary is less likely to cling to them when conditions change. After resets, this mindset emerges naturally. Survivors know their understanding is incomplete. They have seen systems fail. They trust observation more than doctrine. Over time, however, success erodes this humility. Explanations harden, models become identities. Questioning feels dangerous because it threatens stability. This is when knowledge shifts from being a tool to being a belief, and beliefs resist change, even when reality demands it. Ancient myths often encode this moment as a fall, not a moral failure, but a cognitive one, a narrowing of perspective, a refusal to adapt. The stories warn subtly. They do not say collapse will come. They show how rigidity invites it. Kings who ignore signs, societies that dismiss messengers, cultures that mistake continuity for immunity. These narratives repeat across civilizations because the pattern repeats across cycles. What survived the last reset was not certainty, but adaptability disguised as tradition. Rituals that could be reinterpreted, myths that could absorb new meaning, structures that could be repurposed. This malleability allowed knowledge to persist even as context vanished. Göbekli Tepe's abandonment may reflect this same principle. It was not destroyed. It was intentionally buried, preserved rather than erased, as if its builders understood that exposure invites misinterpretation, that some knowledge survives best when removed from immediate use. Burial is not forgetting. It is delayed access, a way of passing something forward without forcing it onto a future unprepared to understand it. The act itself suggests foresight beyond survival. It suggests communication across time. This challenges the assumption that ancient people were focused solely on immediate needs. It implies awareness of long cycles, of recurrence beyond a single lifetime, of responsibility extending into unknown futures. These are not traits of primitive thinking. They are traits of experienced civilizations. As modern humanity uncovers these buried sites, it does so with tools of measurement rather than tools of memory. We date stones, we catalog artifacts, we analyze fragments. Yet the deeper message remains elusive because it was never meant to be explicit. The ancient survivors did not leave instructions, they left conditions. They trusted that future minds facing similar thresholds would recognize the resonance, that awareness would arise not from information, but from familiarity, from the feeling of having been here before. This may be the most unsettling inheritance of all, the possibility that recognition is not new knowledge, but ancient memory resurfacing, and that the question waiting for us was not meant to be answered quickly, but lived with patiently until the cycle reveals whether we have learned to listen differently at last. Listening differently changes the pace of civilization. It slows decisions, widens perspective, and weakens the illusion of urgency that often drives irreversible choices. Ancient cultures that survived resets seem to have valued this slower rhythm, not because they lacked ambition, but because they understood how easily speed turns into fragility. After catastrophe, time feels scarce. Every season matters. Every harvest counts. Yet paradoxically, this scarcity encourages patience. Survivors observe before acting. They test quietly. They wait for patterns to reestablish themselves. This patience is not hesitation. It is recalibration. As stability returns, urgency reappears in a new form. Growth becomes the measure of success. Expansion replaces balance. Speed is rewarded. What once protected civilization now feels like restraint. The wisdom of waiting is reinterpreted as stagnation. This is another subtle fracture point, often invisible while it forms. Ancient myths encode this shift through generational decline. The first age is slow and harmonious. Later ages accelerate, fragment, and conflict. Tools improve, but cohesion weakens. Knowledge spreads, but understanding thins. The world becomes louder, faster, and less attentive. In these stories, catastrophe does not arrive suddenly. It follows acceleration. A civilization outruns its own memory. The warnings are present but drowned out by momentum. When collapse finally occurs, it feels abrupt only because the long preparation for it went unnoticed. The survivors who follow inherit a quieter world, fewer structures, fewer certainties. more space to listen again. The cycle resets not just materially, but perceptually. Silence returns. Observation resumes. Memory begins its slow reconstruction. This rhythm suggests that resets are not merely destructive, they are corrective, restoring a tempo humanity struggles to maintain voluntarily. They strip away excess, forcing attention back to fundamentals: land, sky, season, community. In this stripped state, memory has room to breathe. The question, then, is not whether acceleration causes collapse, but whether humanity can choose deceleration without catastrophe, whether awareness can substitute for disruption, whether listening can replace erasure. Ancient survivors may have doubted this possibility. Their preparations suggest expectation rather than hope. They built for endurance, not prevention. They assumed interruption and worked within it. Their legacy is resilient, but it carries a quiet resignation. As we move forward, surrounded by inherited fragments and rediscovered alignments, we stand at a familiar threshold. The conditions resemble those before, but the awareness may be different, or it may only feel different. The cycle does not demand belief. It does not require acknowledgement. It continues regardless. The only variable it has ever allowed is attention, and attention, once awakened, cannot easily return to sleep. Whether that is enough to alter the rhythm, or simply enough to recognize it as it turns again, remains the unanswered inheritance passed down from the last reset, waiting now, as it always has, in the space between memory and choice. That space between memory and choice is where civilizations linger the longest. It is a narrow corridor, easily overlooked, where awareness exists without commitment. Ancient cultures seem to understand that this space could not be occupied indefinitely. Eventually, choice collapses back into habit, and habit resumes the cycle. After resets, this space is wide. Everything feels provisional. Nothing is taken for granted. People live closer to consequence, closer to land, closer to one another. Decisions are weighed not only by benefit, but by survival. In this phase, memory is active. It guides behavior directly. As generations pass, distance grows. The consequences that once shaped every choice recede into story. Memory becomes symbolic rather than instructive. The space narrows. Choice becomes less conscious. Civilization begins to move again on momentum rather than intention. This transition is rarely dramatic. There is no single moment when awareness is lost. It fades incrementally, replaced by confidence in systems, faith in continuity, trust in scale. What once required attention now feels automatic. The world appears stable enough to ignore its deeper patterns. Ancient warnings often appear at this stage as prophecies, not because the future was known, but because the pattern was familiar. Those who remembered previous cycles recognized the signs. They spoke of imbalance, of forgetting, of hubris. Their words were not predictions. They were observations repeated. Yet observation alone could not halt momentum. Civilizations listen politely to warnings while continuing forward. Prophets are remembered after collapse, not before it. This, too, is part of the cycle. Memory is validated only once it is too late to act on it. The survivors who follow inherit fragments of these warnings, enough to inspire reverence, not enough to change behavior. The message persists, but its urgency dissolves. Over time, it becomes myth again, waiting for the next collapse to restore its meaning. This may be why ancient knowledge feels simultaneously profound and insufficient. It offers insight, but not escape, awareness, but not immunity. It teaches us what has happened, not how to prevent it, or perhaps it teaches prevention in ways we struggle to accept. The idea that limits must be respected, that growth must pause, that attention must replace acceleration. These lessons run counter to the instincts of expanding civilizations. They ask for restraint where reward systems encourage excess. Ancient survivors may have recognized this conflict. Their preparations suggest they did not expect humanity to change its nature. They expected repetition. Their focus was not on altering the cycle, but on ensuring something meaningful endured through it. This reframes survival itself. It is not about preserving everything. It is about choosing what matters most, what deserves to pass through collapse and continue shaping the next world. As we inherit these choices, often unknowingly, we become participants in decisions made long before us. The question is whether we can recognize which inheritances are guiding us now, and whether we can choose differently while there is still space to choose at all. Choosing differently has never meant choosing freely. Every civilization operates within constraints shaped by environment, memory, and inheritance. Even when alternatives appear, they are filtered through what feels familiar, safe, and proven. The past exerts gravity, pulling decisions toward patterns that have worked before, even if those patterns also carried hidden costs. After resets, this gravity is weaker. With fewer structures in place, people improvise. They adapt quickly. They test boundaries because there is little left to lose. In these moments, humanity feels closest to freedom. Yet this freedom is temporary. As soon as stability returns, gravity reasserts itself. Familiar forms solidify. Memory condenses into tradition. This condensation is necessary. Without it, societies cannot scale. Shared rules, shared symbols, shared calendars allow coordination beyond small groups. But condensation also fixes behavior. What was once adaptive becomes rigid. What was once flexible becomes law. The same mechanisms that enable civilization eventually constrain it. Ancient knowledge reflects this tension. It often appears paradoxical, promoting both order and impermanence. Laws are sacred, yet cycles are inevitable. Structures are precise, yet destruction is expected. This duality suggests an awareness that stability and collapse are not opposites, but partners. Göbekli Tepe's careful burial may symbolize this understanding. By sealing it beneath the earth, its builders removed it from the flow of daily life while preserving it for a distant future. They accepted that their present could not carry its meaning indefinitely. Instead of forcing continuity, they deferred it. Deferral is a form of choice. It acknowledges limitation without surrendering responsibility. Rather than attempting to control outcomes across millennia, ancient survivors focused on preserving conditions for rediscovery. They trusted that future minds facing similar pressures would recognize what mattered. This trust is striking. It implies confidence not in permanence, but in recurrence, in the idea that humanity would return to the same questions, the same thresholds, the same need for orientation. What mattered was not preventing the cycle, but ensuring that each return was not entirely blind. Modern civilization often frames inheritance as burden or obstacle. The past is something to overcome. Yet ancient preparations suggest a different view. Inheritance is guidance, not restriction. It narrows possibilities, but also prevents complete disorientation after collapse. The danger arises when inheritance is mistaken for destiny, when patterns are followed simply because they are old. This is when choice disappears. The cycle continues, not because it must, but because alternatives no longer feel imaginable. Ancient myths sometimes resolve this tension through renewal figures, characters who remember differently, who step outside inherited patterns without rejecting them entirely. These figures do not stop the cycle. They slightly alter its shape, enough to carry something new forward. Whether such alteration accumulates over cycles or is smoothed away by repetition remains unclear. History offers no definitive answer, only variations on the same theme. As we stand within our own inherited structures, surrounded by fragments of older choices, the question persists quietly. Not whether we can escape the cycle, but whether we can influence what passes through it next, what we preserve, what we bury, and what we trust the future to rediscover when memory thins once again. Rediscovery is never neutral. What returns from burial does so changed, filtered through the assumptions of those who uncover it. Ancient survivors seem to understand this risk. They did not attempt to preserve meaning intact. They preserved prompts, alignments, questions shaped in stone and story, designed to provoke recognition rather than deliver instruction. This approach accepts distortion as inevitable. Over long spans of time, no message remains pure. Language shifts, symbols drift, context dissolves. Trying to prevent this would require a level of control no civilization has ever achieved. Instead, ancient preparations appear to have aimed for resonance, a feeling of familiarity strong enough to trigger curiosity. Göbekli Tepe does this effectively. It unsettles. It resists easy classification. It disrupts timelines. It forces modern observers to pause and reconsider assumptions about beginnings. That pause is the message, not an answer, but an interruption in certainty. After resets, interruption is valuable. It creates space for attention. Without it, rebuilding follows the easiest path, often replicating old vulnerabilities. A moment of doubt, introduced at the right time, can redirect an entire trajectory. Ancient survivors may have hoped for this, not prevention, but deviation. Deviation does not require abandoning inheritance. It requires reinterpreting it. The same story can guide differently when heard with awareness of cycles. The same ritual can shift meaning when understood as preservation rather than obedience. The same structure can become a reminder rather than a command. Yet reinterpretation depends on timing. Too early, and the message is ignored. Too late, and momentum overwhelms it. This narrow window may be why ancient preparations feel understated. They do not demand attention, they wait for it. Modern humanity may be approaching such a window again. Not because collapse is imminent, but because awareness of fragility has returned. Rare celestial events, environmental instability, and historical rediscovery converge to remind us that continuity is conditional. In this context, the idea of 3i or Atlas functions as a symbol rather than a cause. It reminds us that external forces have always intersected with human history, that civilization exists within a larger system, not apart from it. This reminder alone does not change outcomes, but it reintroduces humility. Humility alters interpretation. It shifts focus from control to resilience, from prediction to preparation, from certainty to attentiveness. These shifts are subtle, but across generations, they shape what is preserved and how. Ancient survivors did not leave blueprints for salvation. They left mirrors, structures, and stories that reflect the observer's state of awareness back to them. To a confident civilization, they appear primitive or decorative. To a questioning one, they feel urgent. This suggests that the value of inherited knowledge is not fixed. It activates differently depending on when it is encountered. The cycle does not require the same response each time. It only provides the opportunity. As we continue forward, surrounded by rediscovered prompts and unresolved questions, the inheritance from the last reset presses gently against the present, not insisting, not warning, simply waiting to see whether this time recognition will be followed by interpretation, and interpretation by choice, before habit once again takes over and carries the cycle onward. Habit is powerful because it feels invisible. It moves beneath awareness, shaping behavior without announcing itself. Civilizations do not choose repetition consciously. They drift into it, guided by systems designed to reduce effort and uncertainty. Over time, these systems become the civilization itself, leaving little room for reflection. Ancient survivors likely recognized this drift. Their preparations suggest an understanding that awareness fades not through malice or ignorance, but through comfort. When life stabilizes, attention relaxes, memory becomes background noise, the extraordinary becomes ordinary, and the ordinary is no longer examined. This is why so much inherited knowledge is indirect. It avoids explicit instruction, which invites rigid adherence. Instead, it embeds reminders into cycles that cannot be ignored entirely. Seasons return, stars rise, floods recur. Even when forgotten, these patterns reassert themselves, forcing moments of recognition. The challenge is that recognition alone does not break habit. It interrupts it briefly, then habit adapts. Civilizations absorb anomalies, reinterpret warnings, and continue forward. This adaptive capacity is a strength, but it also ensures that the deeper trajectory remains unchanged. Ancient myths often reflect this paradox. Heroes receive warnings yet proceed. Prophecies are fulfilled precisely because they are acted upon incorrectly. Attempts to control outcomes accelerate them. These stories suggest an awareness that intervention without understanding can be as dangerous as inaction. After resets, understanding is shallow but sincere. People know they do not know. This humility keeps habit flexible. Over time, as knowledge accumulates, certainty grows faster than wisdom. Habit hardens. The space for reevaluation shrinks. This progression appears inevitable, but ancient preparations imply that inevitability was not the final word. They aimed to introduce friction, a pause, a question that could not be easily absorbed into routine. Göbekli Tepe does this by existing where it should not, by demanding explanation without offering one. Such friction disrupts habit temporarily. It creates a moment when attention returns, when assumptions loosen. Whether this moment leads to change depends on what follows. If systems adapt without reflection, the interruption is lost. If reflection deepens, the trajectory can shift slightly. Slight shifts matter over long cycles. They do not prevent collapse, but they influence what survives it. A different emphasis, a different memory preserved, a different question carried forward. Ancient survivors may have accepted that collapse was unavoidable, but content within collapse was not. They focused on shaping inheritance rather than outcome, on influencing what the next civilization would begin with. This reframes responsibility. It extends beyond prevention into curation. What do we choose to embed into habit, knowing habit will outlast awareness? What questions do we make unavoidable? What reminders do we place where forgetting is hardest? As our own systems grow more seamless, more efficient, more invisible, the ancient strategy becomes newly relevant, not to halt progress, but to complicate it, to ensure that attention has somewhere to return when habit becomes too smooth. The cycle continues regardless, but within it, small differences accumulate. And those differences determine not whether civilization survives a reset, but what kind of civilization emerges afterward, carrying forward whatever we decide, consciously or not, to leave behind. What is left behind is rarely chosen all at once. It accumulates through countless small decisions, habits repeated until they feel inevitable. Civilizations do not curate their inheritance deliberately. They curate it indirectly, by what they reward, what they ignore, and what they assume will always be there. Ancient survivors understood scarcity differently. Having witnessed loss on a scale difficult to imagine, they treated continuity as fragile. Redundancy mattered. Knowledge was spread across practices, not centralized in single repositories. Meaning was reinforced through repetition, not efficiency. This made memory heavier, slower, but harder to erase. As civilizations recover, the logic reverses. Redundancy feels wasteful. Efficiency becomes virtue. Systems consolidate. Knowledge concentrates. Memory externalizes into structures that assume uninterrupted access. This creates power and speed, but it also creates vulnerability. When interruption arrives, it strikes at the core. This pattern repeats so consistently that it appears almost biological. Growth favors specialization. Specialization favors dependence. Dependence favors fragility. Collapse resets the system, scattering knowledge back into smaller, more resilient forms. The cycle breathes in and out. Ancient myths encode this rhythm as expansion and contraction, ages of abundance followed by ages of loss, knowledge gained, then scattered, fire stolen from the gods, then hidden, seeds preserved through winter. These stories normalize loss as part of continuity, not its opposite. Yet normalization carries risk. When loss is expected, prevention loses urgency. Preparation replaces transformation. The cycle continues because it is anticipated, not challenged. This acceptance may have stabilized rebuilding, but it also ensured repetition. The survivors of previous resets likely lived with this tension. They prepared for loss while quietly hoping for something more. Their preparations suggest neither despair nor certainty, but cautious persistence, a willingness to endure while leaving room for a different outcome. Modern humanity stands in a similar tension, though often without recognizing it. We preserve data obsessively, yet struggle to preserve meaning. We store vast amounts of information, yet rely on systems so complex that interruption would render much of it inaccessible. We assume continuity while quietly fearing its absence. This contradiction mirrors the moments before previous resets, not because catastrophe is imminent, but because awareness and habit are misaligned. Attention has returned, but behavior has not yet changed. The space between memory and choice remains open, but narrowing. Ancient preparations were designed for this space, not to dictate action, but to slow it, to remind civilizations that acceleration without reflection leads back to the same thresholds, to offer a chance, however small, to carry something different forward. What that something is has never been defined clearly, perhaps because it cannot be. Each cycle must decide for itself what matters most. The only constant is the opportunity to choose intentionally rather than automatically. As we continue to inherit fragments from worlds that ended before ours began, the quiet work of curation continues, whether acknowledged or not. And with each repetition, the question deepens. Not what will survive the next reset, but what we are shaping right now that will one day be all that remains, waiting patiently to be rediscovered by those who come after, wondering who we were, and whether we understood the moment we were living in at all. Understanding the moment has always been more difficult than surviving it. Survival is reactive. It responds to immediate conditions. Understanding requires distance, perspective, and patience, qualities rarely available when momentum is high. Civilizations tend to comprehend their turning points only after passing them. Ancient survivors may have sensed this limitation. Their preparations imply an acceptance that full understanding would not arrive in time. Instead of attempting to solve the cycle, they worked around it. They focused on continuity rather than correction, endurance rather than escape. This approach shaped how memory was framed. It avoided specificity that could become obsolete. It emphasized patterns over predictions, floods, fires, darkness, renewal. These were not forecasts, but categories of experience, broad enough to remain relevant, precise enough to guide response. By thinking in patterns, ancient cultures insulated memory from error. Even if the details changed, the response remained useful. Prepare for loss, preserve seeds, observe the sky, stay attentive to imbalance. These lessons survived because they did not depend on a single scenario. As civilizations rebuilt, pattern thinking slowly gave way to event thinking. History became a sequence of unique moments rather than recurring phases. Each challenge was treated as unprecedented. This shift increased confidence but reduced preparedness. When everything feels new, nothing feels familiar enough to anticipate. This may explain why modern societies struggle to integrate ancient warnings meaningfully. The language of cycles conflicts with the language of progress. Repetition feels regressive. Recurrence feels like failure. Yet the cycle persists regardless of how it is interpreted. Ancient survivors likely did not frame the cycle as tragedy. They framed it as condition, something to work within rather than defeat. This acceptance allowed them to act calmly after catastrophe, to rebuild without panic, to embed memory without desperation. Calm is a recurring trait in surviving cultures. Not apathy, but steadiness. The ability to act without believing every action must be final. This perspective reduces overreaction and underreaction alike. It encourages measured response, informed by memory rather than fear. As awareness returns in later civilizations, calm is often absent. Recognition arrives layered with urgency, anxiety, and desire for control. The instinct is to intervene aggressively, to prevent at all costs. Yet ancient patterns suggest that frantic intervention can destabilize as much as neglect. This contrast highlights a deeper lesson. Survival across cycles may depend less on forceful change and more on sustained attentiveness, on resisting the urge to finalize answers, on maintaining openness to correction even during success. Ancient preparations reflect this openness. They do not claim authority. They do not demand obedience. They invite interpretation. They wait for the right moment, trusting that attention will return when conditions resemble those that first shaped them. As we move further into our own moment of recognition, the question sharpens. Can awareness be accompanied by calm? Can attention coexist with restraint? Or will recognition once again accelerate behavior rather than soften it? The cycle does not require resolution. It requires response. And response, shaped by memory, reveals not whether a civilization knows what is coming, but whether it understands how it tends to behave when it believes it does. In that difference lies the subtle inheritance passed forward from the last reset, waiting to see whether this time awareness will mature into something quieter, slower, and perhaps just different enough to change what the next survivors will find when they begin again. What the next survivors will find depends less on what we build than on how we think while building it. Structures collapse, systems fail, landscapes shift, but assumptions linger. Worldviews imprint themselves onto whatever remains, shaping interpretation long after material evidence is gone. Ancient survivors seemed aware of this. Their concern was not only preservation of tools or techniques, but preservation of perspective. They embedded ways of seeing into myths, rituals, and alignments, knowing that perspective would guide rediscovery more powerfully than instruction ever could. Perspective determines what is noticed. A culture trained to look upward will find meaning in the sky. One trained to listen will hear warnings in silence. One trained to measure only immediate value will overlook anything that does not serve the present moment. These habits outlast knowledge itself. After resets, perspective resets with it. Survivors return to basics. They observe directly. They trust senses over abstractions. Over time, abstraction returns, bringing efficiency and reach, but also distance. The world becomes mediated. Experience becomes interpreted before it is felt. This mediation accelerates forgetting. When meaning is filtered through systems, the system becomes the focus rather than the signal. Ancient preparations resisted this by tying memory to unavoidable experiences. The rising sun, the turning seasons, the repetition of stars. No interface required. Modern civilization increasingly relies on layers between observation and understanding. Data replaces experience. Models replace patterns. Predictions replace attention. These tools are powerful, but they also encourage a belief that reality can be managed rather than participated in. This belief has appeared before. Each time, it coincided with high confidence and low resilience. When systems failed, the shock was greater because direct familiarity with fundamentals had been lost. Relearning became necessary before rebuilding could begin. Ancient survivors avoided this by keeping fundamentals visible. Even as complexity returned, rituals ensured periodic return to basics. Fasts, festivals, cycles of rest. These interruptions slowed momentum and reconnected people to underlying rhythms. As civilizations grow, these interruptions are often minimized or removed. They are seen as inefficiencies, time not optimized, productivity lost. Yet from a cyclical perspective, they are investments in resilience, moments when habit loosens its grip. The removal of interruption is subtle. It feels like progress. Life becomes smoother. Friction decreases. Attention is no longer required to maintain continuity. And in that smoothness, the memory of fragility fades fastest. Ancient preparations seem to anticipate this smoothing. They place friction in unexpected places, monuments that demand explanation, stories that resist closure, calendars that force pause. These are not relics of superstition. They are technologies of remembrance. As we reinterpret these remnants today, we often strip them of their interruptive power. We aestheticize them. We historicize them. We turn them into objects of study rather than sources of reflection. In doing so, we neutralize their original function. Yet even neutralized, they retain a faint pull. a sense that something important is being missed, that the story is incomplete. This feeling is not accidental. It is the residue of perspective embedded long ago, waiting for conditions that allow it to be felt again. Whether we allow that feeling to deepen or dismiss it as curiosity will influence what remains of us, not just in stone or data, but in the assumptions carried forward by those who come after. The next reset will not judge our achievements. It will simply pass through them, leaving behind whatever was resilient enough to endure. And among those remnants, the most influential may not be what we intended to preserve, but what we assumed would never need preserving at all. What is assumed to be permanent is rarely protected. Civilizations invest heavily in what they fear losing, but neglect what they believe is guaranteed. This blind spot appears consistently before resets. Infrastructure is reinforced. Records are expanded. Power is centralized. Yet the underlying assumptions guiding these efforts remain fragile, unexamined, and exposed. Ancient survivors seem to recognize this vulnerability. They did not trust permanence. They trusted repetition. Instead of building systems that required stability, they favored practices that could reemerge after disruption. Instead of preserving exact knowledge, they preserved ways of recovering it. This distinction matters. Exact knowledge depends on continuity. Recovery depends on pattern recognition. When catastrophe erases detail, pattern is what remains. Those who can recognize it rebuild faster, even with fewer resources. Those who cannot must begin again blindly. After resets, the first generations do not rebuild complexity. They rebuild orientation. They learn where they are in time, when to plant, when to gather, when to move. Only after this orientation stabilizes does complexity return. Ancient preparations consistently prioritize this order, suggesting learned experience rather than guesswork. As civilizations advance, this sequence reverses. Complexity arrives first. Orientation is outsourced. Calendars become automated. Observation becomes abstract. People know what to do, but not why or when to change. When disruption occurs, action continues briefly, then stalls. This stall is the true danger, not destruction, but confusion. Systems fail faster than understanding can adapt. The gap between expectation and reality widens. Panic fills the space once occupied by memory. Ancient myths often describe this moment as darkness, chaos, or silence, not because the world ends, but because meaning does. Orientation is lost. Survivors emerge into a world that looks familiar, but no longer behaves as expected. Those who endure are not necessarily the strongest or the most informed. They are the most attentive. They watch closely. They adjust. They rediscover patterns rather than insist on models. Over time, their observations coalesce into new traditions, new myths, new structures. The cycle resumes. What distinguishes one cycle from the next is not scale, but emphasis. Each reset slightly reshapes what is valued, what is remembered, what is embedded into the next world. Over many cycles, these small shifts accumulate, though never enough to break the pattern entirely. Ancient survivors may have hoped for this accumulation. Not a single escape from repetition, but gradual refinement, a slow shaping of inheritance toward greater awareness, greater restraint, greater resilience. Whether this hope was realistic remains uncertain. What is clear is that the cycle has never reset completely. Something always survives. Something always guides the rebuilding. The question has never been whether continuity exists, but what form it takes. As we stand now, surrounded by systems that assume uninterrupted time, the ancient strategy feels distant yet relevant. To prepare not by predicting every outcome, but by strengthening the ability to reorient, to embed memory not only in records, but in attention itself. The last reset did not erase humanity, it reshaped it. The next one, whenever and however it arrives, will do the same. And what it shapes us into will depend on what we choose to notice, protect, and pass forward now, while continuity still feels secure enough to be taken for granted. Beyond this point, the story does not end. It turns. It turns through forces older than memory, through pressures that build quietly beneath the surface of continuity. Ancient cultures often described these forces as primordial, impersonal, neither cruel nor kind. They were simply corrective. When imbalance grew too great, when systems stretched beyond resilience, the world adjusted. These adjustments did not always arrive suddenly. Sometimes they unfolded over centuries. Shorelines receded, climates shifted, species disappeared, migration replaced settlement. From within the moment, these changes felt gradual, manageable. Only later did they reveal themselves as thresholds crossed. Other times, correction arrived swiftly. Floods surged, fires spread, darkness lingered. In these moments, the illusion of control vanished completely. What remained was the most basic truth ancient survivors carried forward. Humanity exists within a larger order, not above it. This realization shaped how catastrophe was remembered, not as punishment, but as consequence, not as chaos, but as response. The world was not broken, it was rebalancing. This framing mattered. It allowed survivors to rebuild without resentment, without the need to assign blame to forces beyond their reach. In many traditions, these catastrophic phases are personified as wars among gods or cosmic struggles. But beneath the imagery lies a simpler observation. Systems collapse when they exceed limits. Complexity without adaptability invites reset. Nature enforces boundaries when they are ignored. Ancient survivors learned this lesson not intellectually, but experientially. They did not theorize collapse. They lived through it. The memory of loss shaped every decision afterward. It tempered ambition. It slowed rebuilding. It emphasized resilience over expansion. Yet even this hard-earned wisdom eroded over time. As generations passed without catastrophe, the urgency faded. The stories remained, but their emotional weight softened. The lessons became allegorical. The boundaries became negotiable again. This is the moment the cycle begins to accelerate toward reset once more. Not because humanity seeks destruction, but because success encourages overreach. Stability invites complexity. Complexity strains balance. Balance responds. Ancient myths often compress this long buildup into dramatic events. A single flood, a single war, a single fire. This compression makes the story memorable, but it hides the true nature of collapse. Most resets are prepared slowly, long before they are experienced suddenly. Understanding this reframes catastrophe itself. The reset is not an interruption of history. It is history expressing itself fully. A phase humanity repeatedly underestimates because it unfolds on timescales longer than individual memory. As we move deeper into the story of resets, the focus shifts from survival to consequence, from what endured to what was lost, from memory preserved to memory erased, because what disappears matters just as much as what remains. In the aftermath of the last great reset, humanity carried forward fragments of knowledge, orientation, and myth. But entire worlds of understanding vanished, languages unspoken, technologies unfinished, perspectives never repeated. These losses shaped the next civilization as profoundly as the survivals. They narrowed possibility. They constrained imagination. They ensured that rebuilding would follow familiar paths rather than unexplored ones. The cycle does not only repeat, it simplifies. And in that simplification lies the quiet tragedy ancient survivors may have felt most deeply. Not the destruction of structures, but the disappearance of futures that would never be imagined again. As the forces that drive resets continue their slow work beneath the surface of time, the question becomes unavoidable. Not only what will survive the next correction, but what will be lost so completely that no echo remains to suggest it ever existed at all. What vanishes without echo leaves the deepest silence. Ancient survivors may have sensed this absence more acutely than any physical ruin. To lose structures is painful, but to lose ways of thinking, questions never asked again, paths never taken, is a quieter erasure. It reshapes the future invisibly. After a reset, humanity does not simply rebuild from fragments. It rebuilds within narrowed horizons. Certain possibilities disappear not because they were wrong, but because the memory required to imagine them is gone. Each cycle trims the tree of potential directions, favoring what has already proven resilient. This pruning creates the illusion of inevitability. When only a few paths remain visible, they appear natural, even destined. Civilizations mistake survival bias for truth. What endures is assumed to be superior. What vanished is assumed to have failed for good reason. This assumption is rarely questioned. Ancient myths hint at this loss through stories of forgotten ages, golden times that cannot be returned to, languages of the gods no longer spoken. These are not merely nostalgic fantasies, they are acknowledgments of cognitive loss, of capacities that once existed but no longer fit within the post-reset world. This loss influences how future catastrophes are interpreted. With fewer conceptual tools available, explanations simplify. Complex interactions become moralized. Consequence becomes punishment. Correction becomes judgment. The narrative tightens, even as reality remains complex. Ancient survivors may have attempted to counter this narrowing by embedding ambiguity into their legacies, symbols that resist single interpretation, myths that contradict one another, structures whose purpose is unclear. These elements preserve openness, preventing the future from collapsing into a single explanatory frame. Göbekli Tepe embodies this ambiguity. It offers no definitive message, no clear hierarchy, no explicit narrative. Its silence resists appropriation. Each attempt to explain it reveals more about the observer than the builders. This is not failure of communication, it is design. Ambiguity preserves possibility. It allows each generation to re-engage with the past creatively, rather than obediently. In a world shaped by loss, this flexibility matters. It keeps imagination alive where certainty would freeze it. Yet ambiguity is uncomfortable. Civilizations prefer clarity, especially during rebuilding. Clear stories stabilize. Clear rules coordinate. Ambiguity slows action. This tension explains why ambiguous inheritances are often sidelined, mythologized, or aestheticized rather than integrated. Still, even sidelined, they persist. They occupy the margins of culture, re-emerging during moments of doubt. When systems strain and explanations falter, attention returns to what resists simplification, the forgotten, the unexplained, the silent. This pattern suggests that what is lost and what survives are intertwined. Loss creates gaps. Survivals fill some of them, but not all. The remaining gaps shape curiosity, fear, and aspiration. They influence what civilizations seek next and what they avoid. As cycles continue, these gaps accumulate. Humanity becomes more capable in certain directions and more blind in others. Progress accelerates where memory aligns with environment and stalls where imagination has been pruned away. The tragedy is not that resets erase everything. It is that they erase selectively, and in doing so, they guide humanity forward along increasingly constrained paths, while entire landscapes of possibility remain buried beneath layers of forgotten time, unreachable not because they are forbidden, but because no one remembers how to look for them anymore. For most of the narrative so far, that absence has been intentional. The ancient world rarely named the forces that reminded it of fragility. It pointed instead. It gestured. It allowed awareness to emerge indirectly. Only when attention was ready did names appear. This is where 3I Atlas enters the story naturally, not as a driver of the past, but as a mirror held up to the present. In the modern sky, objects like 3-Eye Atlas do not arrive with prophecy or intention. They arrive silently, detected by instruments rather than senses, named by systems rather than storytellers. Yet their effect is familiar. They disrupt certainty. They remind us that continuity is conditional, that the sky has always been an active participant in the human story, whether acknowledged or not. Ancient survivors did not need a name like 3-Eye Atlas to understand this. They lived with the awareness that the heavens could intrude, that cycles were not sealed systems, that the boundary between stability and interruption was thinner than it appeared. What they lacked in precision, they compensated for in attentiveness. Today, precision has replaced attentiveness. We measure trajectories, calculate probabilities, and assign confidence levels. These tools are powerful, but they can also anesthetize. When risk is quantified, it feels contained. When events are categorized as rare, they feel dismissible. The sky becomes data rather than presence. 3-Eye Atlas challenges that comfort, not because it is dangerous, but because it is unexpected. It reminds us that not everything fits neatly into established cycles or models, that external variables still exist, that the system we inhabit is larger than the systems we design. This is the same reminder ancient monuments offered in their own language. Göbekli Tepe did not predict catastrophe. It oriented people within a cosmos that included uncertainty. It placed human activity in dialogue with forces beyond control. 3-Eye Atlas does the same, but in a modern register. The difference lies in interpretation. Ancient cultures integrated uncertainty into worldview. Modern culture often isolates it as anomaly, something to monitor, then move past. This response reflects how far we have drifted from cyclical thinking. Yet the psychological effect is strikingly similar. Moments like these provoke questions, not immediate panic, but quiet recalibration. They reopen the space between memory and choice. They ask whether our systems assume too much continuity, whether our inheritance strategies are as resilient as we believe. In this sense, 3-Eye Atlas is not a cause. It is a cue, a reminder that history has always been shaped by intersections between human systems and cosmic context. That resets are not only internal failures, but interactions between complexity and a larger environment. Ancient survivors encoded this awareness without numbers or models. We encode it with data and projections. Both approaches point to the same truth. Civilization is not closed. It is permeable. Whether that permeability becomes a source of humility or denial depends on how the reminder is received. Dismissed as irrelevant, it fades into background noise. Integrated as perspective, it reshapes how continuity is imagined. The past does not require us to fear the sky. It asks us to remember it, to recognize that every civilization before ours lived beneath it, aware that stability was negotiated, not guaranteed. 3-Eye Atlas, in this narrative, functions exactly as intended, not as omen, not as threat, but as a modern echo of an ancient understanding, a quiet signal that the conditions which shaped resets before have never fully left the stage. And once that signal is noticed, the story inevitably deepens, because awareness of vulnerability is not an ending. It is the point where the question shifts from whether continuity can be assumed to how consciously it is being carried forward, knowing that the sky, as it always has, remains part of the equation. Once vulnerability is acknowledged, the past rearranges itself. Ancient stories that once felt symbolic regain weight. Monuments once admired for their mystery begin to feel instructional, not in what they say, but in how they position humanity within a larger system. Awareness changes the lens, and through that lens, continuity looks less secure and more negotiated. Ancient survivors lived with this negotiation daily. They did not assume protection. They assumed exposure. The world could intrude at any time, from the ground beneath their feet or the sky above their heads. This awareness shaped restraint. It limited excess. It kept attention anchored to signals rather than assumptions. Modern civilization has insulated itself from this feeling. Technology buffers experience. Systems absorb shock. Distance grows between cause and consequence. Vulnerability becomes abstract, discussed rather than felt. In this environment, reminders like 3-Eye Atlas feel distant, interesting, but not urgent. Yet ancient resets were rarely urgent until they were unavoidable. The early signs were subtle, a deviation, an anomaly, something that did not fit the established pattern. These signs were often dismissed precisely because they were rare. Normality bias prevailed. Life continued as usual. Only later, when multiple deviations aligned, did the correction become visible. By then, momentum could not be reversed. Survivors emerged not because they predicted collapse, but because they lived in ways that remained functional when systems failed. This distinction matters. Prediction is brittle. It depends on accurate models and stable conditions. Adaptation is resilient. It depends on awareness and flexibility. Ancient cultures favored the latter because it was the only strategy that survived uncertainty. The modern response to cosmic reminders tends toward prediction. We calculate orbits, we estimate probabilities, we reassure ourselves with margins of safety. These practices are not wrong, but they are incomplete. They address specific risks while leaving worldview unchanged. Ancient survivors addressed worldview first. They embedded humility. They normalized impermanence. They treated continuity as something to be maintained rather than assumed. This orientation shaped behavior long before catastrophe arrived. If 3-Eye Atlas has any relevance beyond scientific interest, it lies here, not in what it might do, but in what it reveals about how we think. Whether we still perceive ourselves as insulated observers or as participants within a dynamic system that includes forces beyond prediction. The ancient world did not separate cosmology from survival. The sky was not background. It was context. Modern civilization has largely reversed this relationship. Survival is engineered. Cosmology is optional. This separation increases efficiency, but it also increases fragility. Reintegrating context does not require abandoning technology. It requires rebalancing attention, remembering that systems exist within environments, and environments change. That continuity depends not only on control, but on responsiveness. Ancient monuments remind us of this by their very endurance. They survived not because they resisted time, but because they aligned with it. They accepted exposure. They weathered cycles. They remained meaningful across interruptions. As we move deeper into a world defined by complex interdependence, the ancient strategy feels less primitive and more instructive, not as a solution but as orientation, a way of standing within uncertainty without being paralyzed by it. The cycle continues to turn. The sky remains active. Humanity remains inventive. The question is whether these elements remain isolated or whether they are brought back into dialogue. Because dialogue, unlike prediction, does not assume the future. It listens for it. And listening, as ancient survivors understood, is often the difference between being surprised by a reset and being shaped by what comes after it. Being shaped by what comes after requires a different relationship with time. Ancient cultures did not rush toward the future. They moved through it, aware that tomorrow was not an escape from yesterday, but its continuation. This awareness softened ambition without extinguishing it. Progress existed, but it unfolded within boundaries informed by memory. After resets, this temporal humility is unavoidable. Survivors live close to consequence. The future feels uncertain, but not abstract. Every decision carries weight because margins are thin. In this state, time is experienced as layered rather than linear. The past feels near. The future feels provisional. As civilizations recover, this relationship changes. Distance grows between action and outcome. Systems absorb delay. Consequences stretch across generations. Time flattens into a horizon that seems endlessly expandable. This perception fuels growth, but it also erases urgency where it matters most. Ancient preparations appear to counter this flattening. They reintroduce depth into time. Monuments align past, present, and future in a single gesture. Myths collapse generations into cycles. Rituals force periodic return to origins. These practices remind participants that time is not a straight road, but a field with repeating contours. When modern observers encounter these remnants, the effect is often disorientation. The scale feels wrong. The priorities feel misplaced. Why invest so much effort in alignment rather than comfort? Why carve stone for memory instead of shelter? These questions arise because our relationship with time has shifted. We prioritize immediacy. Ancient cultures prioritized continuity. Neither approach is inherently superior, but each carries trade-offs. Immediacy accelerates innovation. Continuity preserves resilience. The balance between them determines how a civilization responds to disruption. Resets expose imbalance brutally. When immediacy dominates, systems fail fast. When continuity dominates, rebuilding is slow but steady. Ancient survivors appear to have favored the latter, not out of conservatism, but because it endured. This endurance did not mean stagnation. Knowledge evolved, tools improved, but change was filtered through memory rather than appetite. The future was approached cautiously, tested against what had already been lost once before. As awareness returns in later cycles, the temptation is to recover this balance intentionally, to integrate memory into planning, to slow where speed increases fragility, to preserve redundancy where efficiency threatens resilience. Yet intentional balance is difficult to sustain. It competes with incentives that reward growth, novelty, and scale. Over time, these incentives reshape priorities, and the old imbalance reemerges, even among those who recognize it. Ancient survivors may have accepted this. Their legacy suggests realism rather than idealism. They prepared not for perfect continuity, but for imperfect recurrence, for civilizations that would remember just enough to rebuild, but not enough to avoid repeating certain patterns. This acceptance does not diminish their effort. It clarifies it. They worked within limits, aiming not to solve time, but to participate in it more consciously. As we continue forward, carrying both advanced systems and ancient echoes, the challenge is not to romanticize the past or reject the present. It is to notice how our relationship with time is shaping what we preserve, what we neglect, and what we assume will always be there. Because when the cycle turns again, as it always has, it will not ask what we believed about the future. It will reveal what we understood about time itself. Understanding time does not grant control over it. Ancient cultures seem to accept this limitation more readily than we do. They did not attempt to master time. They attempted to move with it. This distinction shaped how they responded to disruption and how they imagined continuity beyond their own lifespan. After resets, time feels heavy. Each season carries memory. Each delay feels dangerous. Survivors act deliberately, aware that rushing invites mistakes they cannot afford. This slowness is not hesitation. It is alignment. Action is synchronized with conditions rather than imposed upon them. As civilizations stabilize, this alignment loosens. Time becomes something to manage rather than observe. Calendars automate. Schedules compress. The future is divided into projections and deadlines. In this framework, patience feels inefficient, even irresponsible. Speed becomes proof of capability. Ancient warnings often appear at the moment when speed outpaces understanding. Myths describe hubris not as arrogance, but as misalignment. Acting before listening, expanding before stabilizing, building faster than memory can guide. These stories do not condemn ambition. They caution against acceleration without context. The last reset likely arrived after such a misalignment. Not suddenly, but predictably, once thresholds were crossed. The survivors who followed were those whose lives remained synchronized with slower rhythms. Those who could pause, adapt, and wait without losing cohesion. This is why ancient legacies emphasize cycles over events. Cycles restore alignment. They force return. They prevent permanent drift. When cycles are ignored or overridden, systems stretch until they fail. Time reasserts itself through disruption. Modern civilization often attempts to override cycles. We insulate against seasonality. We smooth variability. We minimize interruption. These achievements bring comfort and scale, but they also reduce sensitivity. When change finally penetrates these buffers, it arrives amplified. Ancient survivors would have recognized this pattern intuitively. They did not seek insulation. They sought familiarity. By living close to cycles, they accepted inconvenience in exchange for awareness. This trade-off favored survival over comfort. The challenge for later civilizations is that comfort becomes identity. To question it feels like regression. Yet ancient memory suggests that comfort, when unexamined, is a temporary state rather than a permanent achievement. As awareness of cycles returns, the temptation is to romanticize hardship or reject modern systems. Ancient preparations do not support this extreme. They suggest moderation, integration, remembering cycles without abandoning progress. This balance is fragile. It requires ongoing attention, which habit constantly erodes. Over time, the effort to remain aligned feels unnecessary. Systems take over. Memory recedes. The cycle resumes its slow preparation for correction. Ancient survivors likely knew this would happen. Their work was not a solution, but a gesture, a way of leaving behind signals for moments like ours, when speed is high, complexity is dense, and attention is stretched thin. Those signals do not tell us what to do. They remind us how easily alignment can be lost and how costly it is to recover. They suggest that survival across cycles depends less on strength or intelligence and more on the ability to slow down enough to notice when time itself is asking for adjustment. The cycle continues, patient and unhurried. It does not chase humanity. It waits for humanity to outrun itself. Outrunning itself is how civilization most often meets correction, not through sudden malice or cosmic intent, but through momentum unchecked by reflection. When systems grow faster than awareness can follow, imbalance becomes invisible until it is irreversible. Ancient cultures encoded this insight repeatedly, not as warning, but as observation. After resets, momentum is low. Life moves at the speed of necessity. Every action is grounded. Excess feels dangerous. In this state, imbalance is easy to detect because everything is close. Feedback is immediate. Mistakes are felt quickly and corrected instinctively. As rebuilding progresses, distance grows between cause and effect. Systems scale. Specialization deepens. Actions ripple outward beyond perception. This distance dulls sensitivity. By the time imbalance becomes visible, it has already accumulated across layers of complexity. Ancient myths describe this phase as a forgetting of measure, a loss of proportion. Actions become disconnected from consequences. Effort is misapplied. Growth continues even as foundations weaken. This is not ignorance. It is miscalibration. Calibration requires reference points. After resets, those reference points are clear. Scarcity, exposure, and memory provide constant feedback. Over time, reference points shift inward into models, projections, and abstractions. The world is filtered before it is felt. This filtering makes correction harder. Signals are delayed, warnings are debated, anomalies are normalized. The system adapts to strain rather than addressing its source. This adaptive capacity is impressive, but it also masks limits. Ancient survivors seem to understand that limits cannot be negotiated indefinitely. When exceeded, correction arrives without compromise. Their response was not to eliminate limits, but to live visibly within them, to make boundaries part of daily awareness. Modern civilization often treats limits as problems to be solved. Resource constraints, environmental thresholds, and systemic risks are framed as challenges for innovation. This approach has produced remarkable results, but it also encourages the belief that every boundary is temporary. Ancient memory suggests otherwise. Some limits are structural. Some thresholds, once crossed, trigger cascading effects that cannot be reversed by ingenuity alone. This does not negate progress. It contextualizes it. The last reset likely followed such cascades. Multiple pressures aligned. Systems optimized for stability could not adapt quickly enough. Correction unfolded across domains, appearing sudden only because its preparation went unrecognized. The survivors who followed did not inherit a broken world. They inherited a simplified one. Complexity stripped away. Possibility narrowed. In this quieter environment, alignment returned naturally. Limits were visible again. This oscillation between complexity and simplicity defines the long rhythm of civilization. Each phase carries advantages. Complexity enables innovation. Simplicity restores awareness. Neither can be sustained indefinitely without the other. Ancient preparations appear to acknowledge this rhythm without attempting to stop it. They place markers at points of transition. They leave reminders of what was lost and what endured. They trust that future civilizations will encounter the same thresholds and face similar choices. As we move closer to our own thresholds, the ancient perspective offers neither comfort nor alarm. It offers context, a way of seeing momentum, not as destiny but as condition, something that can be observed, questioned, and, in rare moments, gently redirected. Whether such redirection is possible at scale remains uncertain. History offers few clear examples, but even small shifts matter. They influence what collapses cleanly and what fractures violently. They shape what survives intact and what is scattered beyond recovery. The cycle does not demand perfection. It does not reward denial. It responds to balance. And balance, as ancient survivors understood, is not achieved once, but maintained continuously through attention that resists the pull of unchecked speed. When that attention fades, the cycle does what it has always done. It slows the world by force, returning humanity to a pace where memory can catch up again. When memory catches up, it does so abruptly. The slowing imposed by correction feels violent because it contrasts so sharply with the speed that preceded it. Ancient cultures remembered this contrast vividly. Their myths speak of sudden stillness after chaos, silence after noise, emptiness where excess once filled every space. This stillness is not peaceful at first. It is disorienting. Survivors emerge into a world stripped of familiar reference points. Systems that once explained reality no longer function. Authority dissolves. Knowledge fragments. What remains is immediate experience, raw and undeniable. In this state, the mind recalibrates. Without abstractions to lean on, attention returns to fundamentals: light, water, temperature, movement. The body becomes the primary instrument of understanding again. Ancient survivors likely experienced this as both loss and clarity. Loss because so much was gone. Clarity because what remained was essential. This is where the cycle resets most deeply, not at the moment of destruction, but in the quiet aftermath when humanity relearns how to perceive the world without layers of mediation. This relearning is slow, but it is thorough. It rebuilds awareness from the ground up. The first traditions of the next cycle emerge here. Simple rules, repeated actions, observations turned into stories. These early frameworks are not philosophical. They are practical. They stabilize life enough for memory to take hold again. Over time, these frameworks solidify, stories deepen, rituals form, meaning expands. The world becomes interpretable again. Civilization resumes, carrying forward what survived both materially and cognitively. Ancient survivors may have known that this moment of recalibration was the most important phase of all. It determined what kind of civilization would emerge next, whether it would remain attentive for a time or rush back toward complexity as quickly as possible. Their preparations seemed designed to influence this phase subtly, to insert reminders into the rebuilding process, to encourage orientation towards cycles rather than conquest, to slow acceleration just enough to allow memory to embed itself deeply. Göbekli Tepe may represent such an insertion, a gathering place not for survival, but for meaning, built early, before full settlement, before agriculture as we understand it. This suggests a priority on orientation before expansion, on memory before growth. This ordering matters. When meaning precedes complexity, civilization develops with built-in reference points. When complexity precedes meaning, reference points are constructed later, often artificially, and are more easily discarded. The last reset appears to have allowed a brief return to this older ordering, meaning first, expansion later. But as cycles continue, this ordering tends to invert again. The pressure to rebuild quickly overwhelms patience. The opportunity narrows. Ancient memory does not suggest that this narrowing can be prevented entirely. It suggests only that it can be delayed, softened, shaped, enough to influence what survives the next correction. As the cycle turns from catastrophe into renewal, the quiet question ancient survivors seem to ask is not whether humanity will rise again, but how, with what priorities, with what awareness, with what fragments of the previous world guiding its first steps. That question is never answered definitively. It is carried forward, embedded in stone and story, waiting to be asked again by those who find themselves standing at the beginning of something new, surrounded by silence, wondering what came before and what, if anything, can be done differently this time. Standing at that beginning, interpretation begins. This is where the story splits, not into truth and myth, but into ways of understanding what survived. Ancient survivors did not leave manuals explaining what had happened. They left symbols flexible enough to support multiple readings, literal and symbolic, historical and cosmic, practical and metaphysical. Over time, later civilizations argued over which interpretation was correct. Some treated ancient stories as records of events. Others dismissed them as metaphor. This division itself may be a legacy of the reset. When context is lost, meaning fractures. The same inheritance produces competing explanations, each incomplete on its own. Literal readings preserve detail but risk rigidity. Symbolic readings preserve flexibility but risk detachment from reality. Ancient knowledge appears to have lived between these modes. Floods were real, but also cyclical. Gods were characters, but also forces. The sky was physical, but also instructional. This layered approach allowed knowledge to survive reinterpretation. When one reading failed, another remained viable. The mistake of later civilizations was not choosing one interpretation, but insisting on exclusivity. By narrowing meaning, they reduced resilience. Modern analysis often repeats this error. Ancient structures are classified as either ceremonial or functional. Myths are either history or fiction, yet ancient survivors may have seen no such division. Function and meaning were intertwined. Survival and cosmology were the same conversation. Göbekli Tepe illustrates this ambiguity perfectly. Was it a temple, an observatory, a memory device, or a social anchor? The question itself reveals modern categories more than ancient intention. It may have been all of these simultaneously because survival required integration rather than specialization. This integrated worldview blurs the boundary between knowledge and belief. What mattered was not whether a story was literally true, but whether it oriented behavior correctly. Did it encourage attention? Did it preserve balance? Did it survive interruption? As cycles progressed, this pragmatic relationship with meaning eroded. Knowledge became compartmentalized. Belief was separated from function. Ritual lost practicality. Science lost humility. The inheritance fractured along these fault lines. Ancient survivors likely did not foresee the specific forms this fracture would take, but they seem to have anticipated its existence. Their preparations preserve ambiguity precisely where certainty would later harden. They leave room for reintegration. This is why ancient sites feel provocative rather than explanatory. They invite synthesis. They resist reduction. They demand that the observer hold multiple possibilities at once. This cognitive demand mirrors the balance required to survive cycles. Flexibility without chaos. Structure without rigidity. As modern humanity revisits these remnants, the interpretive phase becomes critical. What we choose to see in ancient inheritance shapes how we respond to present vulnerability. If we see only superstition, we discard lessons. If we see only catastrophe, we embrace fear. If we see only symbolism, we risk detachment. The ancient invitation is quieter, to see continuity through layers, to recognize that knowledge can be both literal and symbolic, practical and poetic, without losing effectiveness. This is not confusion, it is resilience. In the interpretation phase of the cycle, civilizations decide whether inherited memory becomes a tool or a relic, whether ambiguity is explored or eliminated, whether questions are preserved or prematurely answered. And in that decision, often unnoticed at the time, the trajectory of the next phase is set, not by fate, but by interpretation. Once interpretation settles, theory follows. Civilizations begin to explain the cycle rather than live within it. Astronomy becomes cosmology. Cosmology becomes narrative. Narrative becomes framework. The unknown is given structure, and structure brings comfort. Yet with comfort comes a subtle loss of attentiveness. Ancient theories of cycles were rarely precise. They avoided exact timelines. They resisted final causes. Instead, they described relationships between sky and land, between abundance and restraint, between forgetting and collapse. These theories were intentionally incomplete, leaving room for correction. Later civilizations sought completion. They wanted definitive models, timelines that could be trusted, causes that could be isolated. This desire is understandable. Precision allows planning. Planning enables expansion. Expansion rewards certainty. But certainty narrows perspective. When models harden, anomalies are treated as errors rather than signals. The cycle continues to operate, but interpretation lags behind reality. Theory replaces observation. Attention shifts inward toward systems of explanation rather than outward toward the world itself. Ancient survivors appear to have anticipated this drift. Their legacy does not provide a single grand theory of resets. It offers fragments, hints, overlapping cosmologies that never fully align. This fragmentation prevents total certainty. It keeps theory provisional. Modern speculative frameworks often attempt to reunify these fragments. They search for a single mechanism, a hidden planet, a recurring astronomical alignment, a lost technology. These theories are compelling because they promise clarity, yet ancient memory cautions against overconcentration. The cycle is unlikely to have one cause. It is emergent, the interaction of environment, complexity, and awareness. External forces matter, but so do internal choices. Reducing resets to a single trigger risks missing their deeper structure. This is where interpretations involving celestial cycles, wandering objects, or long-period events should be held carefully. Not dismissed, but not absolutized. Ancient knowledge treated the sky as context, not destiny. Influence, not command. Even the idea of repeated global floods or cosmic disruptions was framed within broader patterns of imbalance and correction. The sky participated, but it did not act alone. This framing preserved agency without denying vulnerability. As modern theory building accelerates, the temptation is to replace ancient ambiguity with modern certainty, to believe that if the mechanism is identified, the cycle can be controlled. This belief has appeared before, and it has never survived contact with reality. Ancient survivors did not attempt to outthink the cycle. They attempted to outlast it. Their theories were tools for orientation, not domination. They guided behavior without promising escape. This distinction matters deeply in the interpretation phase. A civilization that believes it has solved the cycle behaves differently from one that believes it must live with it. The first accelerates, the second moderates. As speculative models multiply, the ancient question resurfaces, not which theory is correct, but which interpretation preserves resilience, which framework keeps attention alive rather than replacing it, which explanation encourages humility rather than control. The danger is not speculation itself, it is fixation. When a single explanation becomes identity, alternative signals are ignored. The cycle does not announce its correction in advance. It reveals it through patterns that require flexibility to notice. Ancient inheritance offers no final theory because final theories do not survive resets. What survives is a posture, a way of standing within uncertainty without collapsing into fear or arrogance. As we move deeper into interpretation and theory, the challenge is not to choose the most elegant explanation, but to remain aware that explanation itself is part of the cycle, useful, temporary, and always incomplete. In that awareness, ancient and modern thought briefly align, not in answers, but in restraint. Restraint is rarely celebrated, yet it is the quiet thread connecting civilizations that endure through resets. Ancient cultures did not frame restraint as loss. They framed it as alignment. Knowing when not to act was as important as knowing when to move. This sensitivity kept systems adaptable rather than brittle. As theory solidifies, restraint becomes harder to maintain. Explanations invite confidence. Confidence invites expansion. Expansion tests limits. Each step feels justified, even necessary, within the prevailing framework. The cycle advances not through recklessness, but through coherence taken too far. Ancient survivors appear to have recognized this danger. Their fragmented legacies resist full synthesis. They do not coalesce into a single worldview that can dominate behavior entirely. Instead, they remain distributed, forcing continual negotiation between interpretations. This negotiation slows action just enough to preserve balance. Modern civilizations struggle with this friction. Integration is prized. Unified models are efficient. Disagreement is treated as obstacle rather than safeguard. Yet ancient memory suggests that unresolved tension between perspectives is protective. It prevents premature closure. When closure arrives too soon, civilizations behave as if the future has been secured. Planning extends far ahead. Systems optimize for predicted conditions. Flexibility is sacrificed for efficiency. In this state, surprises become threats rather than information. Ancient frameworks treated surprise differently. Anomalies were not immediately dismissed. They were woven into story. A strange event became a myth. A disruption became a lesson. This narrative absorption preserved anomaly as memory rather than erasing it through explanation. Over time, this approach allowed ancient cultures to retain awareness of uncertainty even as stability returned. They did not mistake calm for permanence. They remembered that calm was a phase, not a guarantee. As cycles progressed, this memory weakened. Explanations replaced stories. Stories became entertainment. Entertainment lost authority. The cultural capacity to absorb surprise diminished. When disruption returned, it felt unprecedented. This pattern repeats across civilizations. Each believes itself uniquely advanced, uniquely informed, uniquely capable of managing risk. Each underestimates the cumulative effect of small imbalances and delayed feedback. Each is surprised by the correction it helped prepare. Ancient survivors may have accepted that surprise itself was inevitable. Their focus was not eliminating it, but ensuring that surprise could be integrated rather than resisted, that systems could bend rather than shatter. This philosophy reframes progress. Advancement is not measured by control alone, but by recoverability. How quickly can orientation be restored after disruption? How much meaning survives interruption? How many pathways remain open when one collapses? These questions rarely dominate during periods of growth. They feel pessimistic, limiting, yet they become central immediately after resets, when the cost of neglecting them is fully revealed. The ancient legacy persists precisely because it keeps these questions alive beneath the surface of progress. Even when ignored, they do not disappear. They wait. They resurface during moments of doubt, disruption, or rediscovery. As modern humanity continues to theorize, model, and optimize, the ancient reminder remains quietly relevant. No explanation is final. No system is complete. No cycle has been escaped. Restraint does not mean stagnation. It means remembering that continuity is negotiated moment by moment, not secured once and for all. It means allowing uncertainty to remain visible, even when confidence feels deserved. And in that visibility, civilizations retain their last and most fragile advantage, the ability to recognize when acceleration has outrun alignment and when it is time, once again, to slow down before the cycle decides to do it for them. Slowing down rarely feels urgent until it is no longer possible. Ancient cultures seem to understand this paradox intuitively. They embedded deceleration into ritual, season, and story, knowing that speed carries its own momentum. Without deliberate pauses, momentum becomes destiny. After resets, deceleration is imposed. The world itself slows human activity. Resources are scarce. Networks are fractured. Distance matters again. This enforced slowness creates space for reflection, but it arrives through loss rather than choice. Ancient survivors appear to have hoped for something gentler in future cycles. Their preparations suggest an attempt to normalize pause before catastrophe, festivals that halted labor, sacred days that interrupted productivity, cycles of rest that resisted constant expansion. These practices were not inefficiencies. They were safeguards against runaway momentum. As civilizations modernize, such pauses are reframed as obstacles. Time off becomes optimization problem. Rest becomes recovery for more work. Reflection becomes luxury. The logic is consistent, but it erodes the very spaces where awareness once recalibrated. This erosion does not feel dangerous. It feels productive. Each removal of friction improves flow. Systems become seamless. The world accelerates quietly. By the time imbalance becomes noticeable, the capacity to slow has already been dismantled. Ancient memory warns that this dismantling is cumulative. No single innovation causes collapse. It is the accumulation of accelerations, each justified on its own, that pushes systems beyond resilience. Correction arrives not as punishment, but as restoration of pace. In this light, resets can be seen as the world's way of reintroducing pause when civilizations remove it entirely. Catastrophe forces stillness. Silence returns. The cycle breathes out. Ancient survivors did not celebrate this outcome. They endured it. Their aim was not to invite correction, but to reduce its severity, to ensure that when slowing occurred, something meaningful remained intact. This perspective reframes resilience as temporal rather than material. Not just what survives, but how long it can sustain continuity before needing correction again. Longer cycles indicate better balance. Shorter cycles indicate increasing brittleness. From this view, the goal of civilization is not infinite growth, but extended equilibrium, a state where acceleration and restraint remain in dialogue, where pauses are chosen rather than imposed, where awareness keeps pace with capability. Whether such equilibrium is achievable remains uncertain. History offers few long examples, yet ancient preparations imply belief in its possibility. However fragile, they would not have invested in memory otherwise. As modern humanity navigates unprecedented speed and scale, the ancient question returns with renewed relevance. Can pause be reintroduced without collapse? Can restraint be valued without fear? Can continuity be maintained without erasing vulnerability? These questions are uncomfortable because they challenge core assumptions of progress. They do not offer clear answers. They resist optimization. They ask for judgment rather than calculation. Ancient survivors left no formulas for this judgment. They left reminders, alignments that slow the observer, stories that complicate certainty, monuments that demand time to understand. These reminders function best when encountered unexpectedly, during moments when momentum feels unquestionable. They interrupt flow, reintroducing reflection. Whether reflection leads to change depends on the culture that receives it. As we stand within our own accelerating systems, surrounded by inherited signals and modern anomalies, the choice remains open, but not indefinitely. The space between recognition and habit narrows with speed. If it closes completely, the cycle will intervene as it always has, restoring pause through force. If it remains open, even briefly, something different may pass through the next reset. Not an escape, not a solution, but a subtle shift. Enough to matter to those who will one day stand in silence, rebuilding again, sensing that something from before is guiding their hands, and wondering whether it was placed there intentionally by a civilization that finally learned when to slow. What passes through the reset is never obvious in the moment. Survivors do not know which habits will matter, which ideas will endure, which assumptions will quietly poison rebuilding. They act with what is available, guided by instinct, memory, and necessity. Only much later does inheritance reveal its shape. Ancient cultures seem to have accepted this uncertainty. They did not attempt to script the future. They prepared conditions. They focused on preserving orientation rather than outcome. This restraint suggests an understanding that control diminishes across time, while influence, subtle and indirect, can persist. Influence works through repetition, through patterns encountered often enough to feel natural, through stories told so frequently they become invisible, through structures placed where they will be used again without conscious decision. These are the tools of long memory. After resets, such tools reassert themselves quickly. Survivors gravitate toward familiar forms. They repeat actions that feel right even when reasons are unclear. These repetitions stabilize life. They create coherence before understanding returns. As rebuilding continues, repetition becomes tradition. Tradition becomes identity. Identity resists change. This progression is natural, but it also hardens what was once adaptive. Over time, the same tools that stabilized recovery can restrict growth. Ancient survivors may have anticipated this. Their legacies often contain contradictions, multiple myths explaining the same event, overlapping calendars, inconsistent symbols. These inconsistencies are not errors. They prevent total fixation. They keep interpretation alive. A civilization inheriting such ambiguity cannot fully settle. It must continue negotiating meaning. This negotiation keeps attention engaged longer, delaying the slide into unquestioned habit. Even if eventual fixation occurs, the delay itself matters. It stretches the cycle. Stretching the cycle reduces the severity of correction. Systems have more time to adjust. Imbalances grow more slowly. Memory remains active longer. The reset, when it comes, is less absolute. This may be the most optimistic thread in ancient inheritance. Not that collapse can be avoided, but that its impact can be softened, that continuity can be extended, that something more refined can be passed forward. Modern civilization often seeks decisive solutions, singular breakthroughs, permanent fixes. Ancient memory offers a quieter ambition, incremental improvement across cycles, small refinements carried forward through collapse and recovery alike. From this perspective, progress is not linear advancement within a single civilization. It is cumulative learning across many. Each cycle contributes marginal insight. Each reset tests what holds. Over vast time, these margins add up. This reframing dissolves the urgency of final answers. It shifts focus toward stewardship, toward what we embed into culture now that might guide attention later, even if everything else is lost. Ancient survivors did not know us. They did not imagine our technologies or our theories, yet they prepared for minds like ours, minds that would question origins, that would sense fragility, that would look backward during moments of uncertainty. Their message was not instruction. It was companionship across time, a reassurance that others had stood where we stand now, aware that continuity was fragile and had chosen to leave something behind anyway. As the cycle advances toward its reflective phase, this companionship becomes more apparent. The past feels closer, not because it is understood fully, but because its concerns mirror our own. The questions repeat. The stakes feel familiar. What remains unresolved is whether this familiarity leads to wisdom or repetition, whether recognition deepens into restraint or dissolves into confidence once again. The cycle does not rush this decision. It allows time, but it does not allow infinite time. And in that finite window, civilizations reveal what they truly value, not by what they say, but by what they choose to preserve, repeat, and pass forward, knowing that someday, after silence falls again, those choices may be all that speak for them. What speaks after silence is rarely what was intended to speak. Ancient survivors understood this and planned accordingly. They did not trust declarations or monuments of power. They trusted patterns. They trusted what would be used again, not what would be admired once and forgotten. Power fades quickly after resets. Hierarchies collapse. Titles lose meaning. Authority becomes local and provisional. What remains influential are practices that fit the new reality immediately. Ways of organizing food, time, and cooperation. Ways of interpreting signs and responding to change. This practical influence is why ancient memory embedded itself into daily life rather than grand narratives alone. Calendars mattered more than chronicles. Seasonal rituals mattered more than heroic epics. Orientation mattered more than identity. These elements re-emerged naturally because they addressed immediate needs. Over time, as rebuilding progressed, these practical inheritances were layered with story. Myth provided cohesion. Symbol gave depth. What began as survival guidance became culture, and culture carried memory further than necessity ever could. This layering process is fragile. If story overwhelms practice, meaning detaches from function. If practice loses story, it becomes mechanical and forgettable. Ancient survivors seem to have aimed for balance. Enough narrative to preserve attention. Enough function to remain relevant. Modern civilization often separates these domains. Practice is optimized. Story is aestheticized. The two rarely reinforce one another. This separation increases efficiency in the short term, but weakens endurance. When systems fail, optimized practices may no longer function, and aesthetic stories may no longer guide behavior. Ancient memory suggests that endurance requires reintegration. Story must inform action. Action must reinforce story. This feedback loop keeps memory alive without requiring conscious preservation. Resets expose the strength of this loop. Where story and practice remain aligned, recovery is faster and more coherent. Where they are split, rebuilding is chaotic, directionless, and prone to repetition. This insight reframes ancient monuments. They are not merely symbolic or functional, they are interfaces, places where story and practice intersect, where gathering reinforces meaning, where alignment with cycles becomes communal experience. Göbekli Tepe fits this role precisely. It is not a city, it is not a tool. It is a convergence point, a place where memory could be activated collectively before expansion diluted attention. Its early appearance suggests urgency, not panic, but priority. Ancient survivors may have sensed that the window for embedding memory was brief, that once agriculture, settlement, and hierarchy took hold, attention would scatter. They acted while cohesion was still possible. This urgency contrasts sharply with modern assumptions. We often believe there will always be time to reflect later. That memory can be curated retroactively. Ancient cycles suggest otherwise. Memory must be embedded early, or it competes with systems that will later dominate behavior. As we move toward the final phase of the cycle, this lesson grows quieter but more pressing, not because collapse is imminent, but because opportunities to embed enduring memory narrow as complexity increases. What we normalize now will feel inevitable later. What we neglect now may be unrecoverable after interruption. The past speaks not to frighten, but to remind us of this asymmetry. Ancient survivors did not ask to be remembered. They asked for continuity. They placed fragments of orientation into the flow of human behavior, trusting that some would survive the next silence. As that silence approaches its reflective distance in every cycle, the question remains unchanged. What have we embedded deeply enough to speak when we no longer can? What patterns will re-emerge when systems fall away? The answer will not come from intention. It will come from repetition, from what has been practiced so often that it feels natural. And in that sense, the future is already being prepared quietly through habits we barely notice, shaping what will one day be remembered as the foundation of whatever comes next. What feels natural is the most powerful inheritance of all. It moves beneath ideology and intention, shaping behavior long before reflection can intervene. Ancient survivors understood this deeply. They focused less on teaching values and more on shaping environments where certain behaviors felt obvious, even inevitable. After resets, this shaping happens quickly. With few options available, habits form fast. Choices repeat because they work. Over time, these repetitions define normality. What once required awareness becomes instinct. This is how cultures stabilize before they understand themselves. As rebuilding continues, these instincts are reinforced by success. They appear validated by survival. Questioning them feels unnecessary, even dangerous. The memory of collapse fades, but the habits born from it remain, guiding behavior without reference to their origin. This persistence is both gift and trap. Habits that ensured survival in one phase may constrain adaptation in another. What once protected against scarcity may encourage excess. What once preserved cohesion may suppress diversity. Yet because these habits feel natural, they are rarely examined. Ancient memory hints at this tension repeatedly. Myths speak of laws that once saved a people, but later bound them too tightly, of traditions that preserved order but resisted necessary change. These stories are not condemnations. They are acknowledgments of complexity. The cycle does not punish habit, it tests it. When conditions shift, habits that no longer fit begin to strain systems. At first, adjustments are made at the margins, exceptions are introduced, workarounds appear. The core habit remains untouched. Eventually, strain reaches a threshold. The habit can no longer be adapted without being transformed. At this point, civilizations face a choice, often unconsciously: change the habit or let the cycle change it through correction. Ancient survivors appear to have expected that this choice would rarely be made deliberately. Their preparations suggest realism. They embedded reminders not to abolish habit, but to soften it, to leave openings where reinterpretation could occur before rigidity became fatal. This softening took many forms: festivals that inverted norms, myths that challenged authority, sacred contradictions that prevented total closure. These elements did not dismantle habit, they complicated it. They allowed pressure to release gradually rather than catastrophically. Modern civilization often minimizes such complexity. Consistency is rewarded. Standardization increases efficiency. Exceptions are seen as errors. Yet ancient cycles suggest that exceptions are where resilience hides. Resilience is not the absence of failure. It is the capacity to absorb change without losing orientation. Ancient survivors built this capacity by ensuring that no single habit, belief, or structure dominated completely. Diversity of practice preserved flexibility. As systems grow more interconnected, this diversity becomes harder to maintain. Uniform solutions scale better. Global habits form. When these habits are tested, the stakes are higher because variation has been reduced. This convergence accelerates the cycle. Corrections propagate faster. Recovery becomes more difficult. Ancient memory did not foresee global scale, but it recognized the danger of uniformity. Its fragmented legacies may be an attempt to counter it. As we move toward the closing phase of the narrative, the focus shifts from theory back to lived experience. Not what civilizations believe about cycles, but how they embody them. Not what they predict, but what they practice daily. Because when the cycle turns again, it will not consult archives or models. It will encounter habits, ways of living, assumptions about time, scarcity, and continuity. These will determine how collapse is met and how renewal begins. Ancient survivors left us no commandments for this moment. They left examples, subtle, incomplete, and often misunderstood, but persistent enough to still be here, asking the same quiet question they have always asked. What feels natural to us now, and how will it feel when the world no longer supports it? The answer to that question will shape not only what survives the next reset, but how those survivors understand the world they inherit, standing once again at the edge of silence, guided by habits whose origins they may never fully remember, but whose consequences they will live with all the same. Living with those consequences is the final test of inheritance. Ancient survivors did not expect gratitude from the future. They expected struggle. They understood that whatever endured would be imperfect, shaped by loss as much as intention. Their goal was not to create a flawless legacy, but a survivable one. As cycles accumulate, this realism becomes wisdom. Not optimism, not despair, but acceptance of limits. Acceptance that no civilization escapes the conditions of time, yet some navigate them with greater grace. That grace is not visible during expansion. It reveals itself only under pressure. Pressure exposes what was essential and what was excess. It strips away explanations and leaves behavior. In that moment, the stories a civilization told about itself matter less than the patterns it practiced unconsciously. These patterns determine whether recovery is chaotic or coherent. Ancient memory suggests that coherence after collapse depends on how deeply orientation was embedded before it. Orientation to cycles, to land, to sky, to one another. When these orientations remain intact, rebuilding begins immediately, even in silence. This is why ancient preparations emphasized shared experience, gathering, observation, participation. Memory lived collectively, not archived privately. When collapse scattered people, fragments of this collective memory traveled with them, reassembling when conditions allowed. Modern civilization often places memory outside the body, in data, records, systems. These are powerful extensions, but they are fragile under interruption. Ancient survivors relied more on embodied memory, skills practiced, stories spoken, rhythms lived. These survive displacement. As we approach the reflective end of the cycle, this distinction becomes critical, not because technology is flawed, but because embodiment cannot be outsourced entirely. When systems fail, what remains is what people know how to do without assistance. Ancient cultures trained this knowing deliberately, through repetition, through ritual, through alignment with cycles that required attention. These practices may appear inefficient by modern standards, but they built resilience where efficiency builds dependence. The last reset did not reward the most advanced civilization. It rewarded the most adaptable one, the one whose memory was light enough to carry and deep enough to guide, the one that could rebuild meaning before rebuilding complexity. This reframes what survival truly means. It is not the preservation of structures, but the preservation of orientation, the ability to ask the right questions again, to notice patterns, to recognize when habits no longer fit conditions. As we move toward the closing act of the narrative, the focus shifts from analysis to reflection, from what ancient survivors did to what we are doing now, often without noticing. The cycle does not accuse, it reflects. We inherit not only knowledge, but tendencies, not only stories, but blind spots. The ancient world does not demand that we change. It simply shows us what has happened before and what quietly follows when attention fades. Whether we choose to respond differently remains unresolved. Perhaps it always will be. Perhaps the cycle is not meant to be solved, only understood well enough to soften its edges. The silence after collapse is not empty. It is full of beginnings, but those beginnings are shaped by what came before, by habits practiced, by questions preserved, by orientation embedded deeply enough to survive forgetting. As the story moves toward its final reflections, one truth becomes clear. The civilizations that survive resets do not do so by escaping history. They survive by becoming part of it consciously, accepting impermanence without surrendering meaning. And in that acceptance, something subtle but enduring passes forward. Not answers, not warnings, but a posture toward time itself. One that future survivors may recognize instinctively, feeling that they are not alone in the silence, that others once stood here too, having learned at last how to let go without forgetting who they were. Standing in that silence, survivors rarely feel victorious. They feel small, uncertain, and exposed. Ancient memory does not romanticize this moment. It acknowledges the fear, the loss, the humility that follows collapse, yet it also recognizes something else awakening there, a rare clarity. Without the noise of systems, comparison, and ambition, attention sharpens. The world feels immediate again. Sky, land, weather, and community reclaim significance. In this stripped state, meaning does not need to be manufactured. It emerges naturally from relationship. Ancient survivors may have understood that this clarity was temporary, that as soon as rebuilding succeeded, distraction would return. Their preparations suggest a desire to extend this moment, to stretch awareness across generations before it faded again. This is why reflection becomes central at the end of every cycle. Not instruction, not theory, but contemplation. A turning inward and backward at the same time. A recognition that what was lost cannot be recovered fully, but what remains can still guide. Many ancient traditions place their deepest insights at the end of stories. After the flood, after the war of the gods, after the fall of ages. Wisdom arrives not during triumph, but during quiet aftermath, when ambition has been humbled and attention has returned. These reflective endings are not conclusions. They are releases. They let go of the need to control outcomes. They accept continuity without insisting on permanence. They allow grief and gratitude to coexist without resolution. In this space, humanity remembers that it is not separate from the cycle, not its victim, not its master, but its participant. This recognition dissolves resentment and arrogance alike. It restores proportion. Modern civilization rarely dwells here. Reflection is often rushed, framed as recovery or lesson learned before momentum resumes. Ancient memory invites a slower pause, one that lingers long enough for perspective to settle. This lingering does not halt rebuilding. It shapes it. It influences priorities subtly. It determines whether early structures emphasize domination or orientation, accumulation or balance. These early choices echo far forward. Ancient survivors may not have known how long the next cycle would last. They did not need to. They trusted that if orientation was restored early, continuity would follow naturally, not perfectly, but sufficiently. As we approach the end of this narrative, the tone shifts deliberately, away from analysis, toward quiet acknowledgement. The cycle does not require agreement. It does not require belief. It only requires presence. Presence is what survives longest, long after explanations fail, long after systems collapse, long after names are forgotten. Presence remains in the way people gather, observe, and respond. The past reaches us most clearly not through facts, but through this shared posture, a calm attentiveness, a willingness to live with uncertainty, a respect for forces larger than any single moment. In the end, ancient survivors left behind more than stones and stories. They left a way of standing in time, a way of facing loss without despair and renewal without arrogance. As the cycle continues its quiet turning, that way of standing remains available, not as obligation, but as inheritance, offered gently, without demand. And in the silence that follows reflection, something unexpected often appears. Not fear, not urgency, but a sense of continuity deeper than progress. A feeling that even after endings, the human story does not disappear. It rests, gathers itself, and begins again, carrying forward whatever awareness was strong enough to remain awake when everything else fell silent. Awareness that remains awake through silence changes what comes next. It does not prevent rebuilding, but it influences its tone. The first actions are quieter, less performative, more attentive to balance than to display. Ancient survivors may have recognized that the earliest moments after collapse carry disproportionate weight. In these moments, choices are simple but decisive. Where to settle, when to plant, who to listen to. These decisions shape the next civilization long before complexity returns. They establish patterns that will feel natural later, even when their origins are forgotten. This is why ancient memory places such importance on beginnings after endings. Not because beginnings are pure, but because they are impressionable. Orientation established early persists longest. Once systems solidify, changing direction becomes difficult without disruption. Ancient cultures appear to have invested their greatest care here. They emphasized gathering before hierarchy, observation before expansion, shared meaning before specialization. These priorities did not eliminate conflict or ambition, but they slowed their dominance. As rebuilding advanced, these early orientations faded into background assumption. People no longer remembered choosing them. They simply lived them. This invisibility was their strength. What feels chosen can be abandoned. What feels natural endures. Modern civilization often overlooks this phase. Recovery is framed as speed, reconstruction as scale. Reflection is postponed until stability returns. Ancient cycles suggest the opposite ordering. Reflection first, scale later. This inversion may be the difference between coherence and repetition. The last reset likely allowed only a brief window for such ordering. Ancient survivors acted quickly, not in haste, but in priority. They embedded meaning while cohesion was high and distraction was low. They trusted that later generations would add complexity, but hoped they would do so on a stable foundation. This hope was not always fulfilled, yet enough endured to shape subsequent cycles. Enough to leave traces recognizable thousands of years later. Enough to provoke questions in minds far removed from the original silence. As we stand far from that silence, surrounded by complexity, the ancient lesson becomes harder to apply but more valuable. It suggests that the most important work happens before urgency demands it, before collapse forces simplicity, before systems strip away choice. Reflection, when chosen freely, is gentler than reflection imposed by loss. Attention, when practiced deliberately, is less painful than attention demanded by catastrophe. Ancient survivors may have learned this too late for their own world, but not too late to leave the insight behind. The cycle does not insist that humanity repeat its mistakes. It only removes illusions when they become too heavy to carry. Whether insight accumulates across cycles remains uncertain, but ancient inheritance suggests it does not disappear entirely. As the narrative approaches its final release, the focus narrows further, from civilizations to individuals, from structures to posture, from history to presence. Because whatever survives the next reset will not remember our theories. It will remember how we lived, how we treated time, how we responded to uncertainty, how we balanced ambition with attention. Those qualities do not vanish easily. They imprint themselves on behavior. They persist in habits passed from one person to another, quietly shaping what feels right and what feels excessive. Ancient survivors trusted this kind of transmission more than any monument. They trusted that posture would outlast instruction, that presence would outlast explanation. As the cycle turns once more, that trust remains untested and unresolved. It waits patiently in the way we pause or rush, listen or assume, remember or dismiss. And in that waiting, the past does not judge. It simply watches, as it always has, to see what posture we choose to carry forward when the noise finally fades again, and the world asks us, gently and without words, to begin once more. When the world asks us to begin again, it does not demand answers. It offers conditions, silence, space, uncertainty. These are not punishments. They are invitations. Ancient survivors seem to understand that beginnings are not created by force, but by attention. Attention in this context is not vigilance or fear. It is receptivity, the ability to notice subtle shifts, to feel when balance is returning or slipping away, to sense when habits are forming that will one day feel unquestionable. This sensitivity is fragile, and it fades quickly once noise returns. Ancient cultures tried to honor this fragility by framing beginnings as sacred, not because they were perfect, but because they were formative. Early actions mattered more than later justifications. The first stories told after silence carried disproportionate weight. They shaped how loss was remembered and how hope was expressed. Hope, in ancient memory, was not expectation. It was willingness. Willingness to continue without certainty, to build without guarantee, to trust that meaning could be reconstructed even if truth could not be fully recovered. This form of hope did not rush. It endured. As civilizations matured, hope transformed into promise. Promise hardened into assumption. Assumption eliminated pause. The cycle resumed its familiar acceleration. Ancient survivors did not condemn this transformation. They accepted it as human nature unfolding within time. What they attempted to preserve was not innocence, but orientation, a memory that beginnings require care, that the first layers laid down after collapse will support everything that follows. That attention at the start can soften what must inevitably come later. Modern humanity often stands far from beginnings, yet behaves as if it has endless chances to restart. This illusion is itself a product of long continuity. Ancient cycles suggest that restarts are fewer than they appear, and each carries irreversible loss. This awareness does not demand despair. It invites gentleness toward systems, toward limits, toward one another. Ancient survivors may have discovered that gentleness is not weakness in times of rebuilding. It is precision. It avoids unnecessary fracture. It preserves options. As the narrative reaches its final quiet, the lesson does not crystallize into instruction. It remains a posture, a way of holding uncertainty without tightening around it, a way of acting without insisting on permanence. The cycle has never required humanity to be perfect, only present. Present enough to notice when balance is slipping. Present enough to pause before acceleration becomes compulsion. Present enough to embed memory before distraction takes over. If anything accumulates across cycles, it may be this subtle refinement of presence, not enough to break the pattern, but enough to soften its edges, enough to preserve more each time, enough to reduce the violence of forgetting. Ancient survivors did not know whether this accumulation would succeed. They acted anyway. They left fragments. They trusted repetition. They accepted that their role was not to finish the story, but to pass it forward with a little more care than they had received. As we stand within our own continuity, far from silence, but not immune to it, that same role quietly returns, not imposed, not urgent, simply available. The cycle will continue. It always has. But within it, there remains a narrow space where awareness can choose how to meet what comes next, whether to rush ahead or to pause, whether to dominate or to align, whether to forget quickly or to remember just long enough to shape what survives. In that space, small choices matter. They always have, and whatever comes after us will not know our intentions. It will know our patterns, our pace, our posture toward time, that in the end, is what ancient survivors understood most clearly. They could not control the future, but they could influence how it begins. How the future begins has always been the quiet inheritance, not written in declarations or preserved in names, but encoded in the way one moment hands itself to the next. Ancient survivors did not imagine endings as final. They imagined them as thresholds, passages where something subtle either carried forward or dissolved completely. At the far end of the cycle, where reflection releases into acceptance, there is no demand for resolution, only a gentle settling. The understanding that continuity does not require certainty and meaning does not require permanence. What matters is not how long something lasts, but whether it remains oriented while it does. This orientation is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It lives in pauses taken when speed is possible, in restraint chosen when expansion is available, in attention offered even when distraction would be easier. These choices rarely feel historic in the moment, yet they are precisely what history remembers. Ancient survivors seem to have trusted this deeply. They trusted that presence could outlast collapse, that posture could survive forgetting, that even if everything visible vanished, the way of standing in time could re-emerge through instinct, recognition, and quiet familiarity. This trust was not naive. It was earned. It came from living through silence and discovering that something remained awake within it. That, after loss stripped away excess, what endured was not dominance or achievement, but relationship, to land, to sky, to one another, to time itself. As the cycle completes its turn, this relationship remains the final offering of the past, not as guidance shouted across millennia, but as a calm recognition felt rather than understood, a sense that what is happening now has happened before, and that how we meet it matters more than how we explain it. The civilizations that survived the last reset did not leave us warnings carved in fear. They left us reminders shaped by patience. They accepted that forgetting would happen. They worked within it. They shaped what forgetting would leave behind. Three-Eye Atlas, appearing briefly in the modern sky, belongs to this same lineage of reminders, not as threat, not as prophecy, but as presence, a quiet nudge toward humility, a recognition that continuity is not owned, only participated in. The sky moves, the land shifts, systems rise and dissolve. Humanity adapts, forgets, remembers, and adapts again. The cycle breathes steadily, indifferent to belief, responsive only to balance. In this long rhythm, nothing is wasted entirely. Even collapse refines. Even loss teaches. Even silence carries memory forward in ways that defy intention. As the story releases its final breath, there is no conclusion to deliver, only a return. To the beginning, to attention, to the simple act of noticing where we stand within time. The ancient world does not ask us to fear the next reset. It asks us to remember that resets are not erasures. They are transformations shaped by what was practiced before they arrived. What we carry forward now, consciously or not, will one day feel ancient to those who inherit it. They will not know our names. They will not share our explanations, but they will live inside the patterns we leave behind. And when they look up at the sky, or gather around stones older than memory, or feel the quiet sense that something has happened before, they may pause. In that pause, continuity will reveal itself once more, not as history repeating, but as awareness returning, and the cycle, having turned again, will continue, not loudly, not urgently, but patiently, as it always has.